Welcome back to Storytime Classics. You're listening to part 2 of The Lost Million by William Le Queux, a thrilling tale of mystery and suspense that has captivated readers for over a century. In this final part, covering chapters 18 to 35, the truth begins to surface and the fate of the lost million is finally revealed. If you haven't already, be sure to watch part 1 to enjoy the full experience. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Chapter 18. I make a discovery. The Terminus Hotel at Lyons is, as you know, a large, artistically furnished place at the Parash station, a hotel with a huge and garish restaurant below, decorated in the style known as Art Nouveau. It is a busy spot where rushing travelers are continuously going and coming, and where the excitable Frenchman, fearing to lose his train, is seen at his best. It was there we arrived about 6 o'clock, and at 7 we sat together, a merry trio, at dinner. The cooking was perfect, the wines excellent, and after dinner Shaw mentioned that he had letters to write. Therefore I seized the opportunity to stroll out with Asta, for it was pleasant to walk after so many hours in the car. She was dressed neatly in black coat and skirt, and a small straw hat trimmed with black ribbon, mourning for Guy Nicholson. And as we wandered out, our careless footsteps led us across that wide square called the Cours du Midi and down upon the Quai de la Charite beside the broad, swiftly flowing Rhone, the water of which ran crimson in the brilliant afterglow. A hot, breathless evening, in which half Lyons seemed to be taking an airing along the quays of that winding riverbank which traverses the handsome city. We had turned our backs upon the high railway bridge which spans the river, and set our faces towards the center of the city, when I noticed that Asta seemed again very silent and thoughtful. I inquired the reason, when she replied, "I've been thinking over your curious experience of last night. I've been wondering." "Wondering what?" "I've been trying to discern what connection your experience had with my own up in Yorkshire," she said. "I saw the hand distinctly, a thin, scraggy hand just as you saw it. But I have remained silent because I could not convince myself that such a thing was actually a reality." "Describe the whole circumstance," I urged. "On the occasion when you saw it, was the door of your room locked?" "Most certainly," was her reply. "Louise, who is married to a solicitor in Scarborough, invited me up to stay a week with her, and I went alone, Dad having gone to London. The house was on the Esplanade, one of the row of big gray houses that face the sea on the south cliff. The family consisted only of Louise, her husband, 3 maids, and myself, as visitor. My room was on the 2nd floor in the front facing the sea, and my experience was almost identical with that of yourself last night. I was awakened just before dawn by feeling a cold touch upon my cheek, and opening my eyes I saw the hand. It seemed to be the horrible hand of Death himself. Most extraordinary, I ejaculated. Since then, Mr. Kemble, I have wondered whether that touch was not sent as warning of impending evil, sent to forewarn me of the sudden death of the man I loved." I was silent. The circumstances, so curiously identical, were certainly alarming. Indeed, I could see that the narration of my extraordinary experience had terrified her. She seemed to have become suddenly most solicitous regarding my welfare, for after a slight pause, she exclaimed anxiously, "Do, Mr. Kemble, take every precaution to secure your own safety. Somehow, I don't know how it is, but I feel that the hand is seen as warning, a warning against something which threatens, against some evil of which we have no expectation, or it warned you of the terrible blow which so soon afterwards fell upon you." I interrupted. "And it has warned me of what?" She shook her head. "How can we tell?" she asked. In a flash the remembrance of that bronze cylinder and the dire misfortune which had befallen every one of its possessors occurred to me. I recollected the ancient hieroglyphics upon the scraps of brown, crinkled papyri and their translation. But surely the apparition of the hand could have no connection with what had been written long ago, before our Christian era. "Did you actually feel the cold touch of the hand?" I asked her in eagerness. "Yes, it awakened me, just as it awakened you. And there was no one else in the house but the persons you named." "I mean, you're positive that you were not a victim of any practical joke, Miss Seymour?" I asked. "Quite certain." The door of my room was locked and bolted. It was at the head of the stairs. There were 4 rooms on that floor, but only mine was occupied. The window? If I recollect aright, most of the houses on the esplanade at Scarborough have balconies, I remarked. Mine had a balcony, it is true, but both windows were securely fastened. I recollected latching them before retiring, as is my habit. Then nobody could possibly have entered there? Nobody. Yet I have a distinct recollection of having been touched by, and having actually seen, the hand being withdrawn from my pillow. I rushed out of the room and alarmed the house. In a few moments, everyone came out of their rooms, but when I told my story, they laughed at me in ridicule, and Louise took me back to bed, declaring that I must have had a bad dream. But I could sleep there no longer and returned home next day. I did not tell Dad, because I knew that he would only poke fun at me. For some moments I did not speak. Surely ours was a strange conversation in that busy modern thoroughfare, amid the cafe idlers seated out in the roadway, and the lounging groups enjoying the cool air from the river after the heat and burden of the day. Strange it was, very strange, that almost the same inexplicable circumstances had occurred to her as to me. Had I been superstitious, I certainly should have been inclined to the belief that the uncanny hand, which was so material that it had left its imprint upon my flesh, was actually some evil foreboding connected with the bronze cylinder. The thing which the papyri decreed shall not speak until the day of awakening. Was not the curse of the wolf god placed upon anyone who sought knowledge of the contents of that cylinder, which had been placed for security in the tomb of the great Marinta, King of Kings? Even contact with the human hand was forbidden under pain of the wrath of the sun god and of Osiris the Eternal. As I walked there, I recalled the quaint decipher of those ancient hieroglyphics. Yes, the incident was the most weird and inexplicable that had ever happened to me. The whole problem, indeed, defied solution. I had not attempted to open the cylinder, nor to seek knowledge of what was contained therein. It still reposed in the safe in the library at Upton End, together with that old newspaper, the threatening letter, and the translation of the papyri. We wandered along the quay, Asta appearing unusually pale and pensive. "I wonder you did not recount your strange experience to your father," I exclaimed presently. "It happened in the house of a friend, and not at home. Therefore I resolved to say nothing. Indeed, I had grown to believe that, after all, it must have been mere imagination, until you described what happened to you last night. That has caused me to think. It has convinced me that what I saw was material and real. It's a mystery, Miss Seymour," I said, "one which we must both endeavor to elucidate. Let us say nothing, not even to your father. We will keep our own counsel and watch." When we returned to the hotel, we found Shaw awaiting us. Asta, being fatigued, retired to her room, and afterwards he and I strolled down to one of those big cafes in the Place Bellecour. A string band was playing a waltz, and hundreds of people were sitting out upon the pavement, drinking their bock or mazagran. Darkness had fallen, and with it the air became fresher. Welcome indeed after those long hours on the white, dusty road of the Bourgogne. My host, in the ease of straw hat and gray flannel suit, still wore his dark glasses, and as we sat together at one of the tin tables near the curb, a man and a woman at the adjacent table rose and left, so that we were comparatively alone and in the shadow. After we had been chatting merrily, for he seemed in the best of spirits and full of admiration of the way in which the French roads were kept, he removed his spectacles and wiped them. As he did so, he laughed across at me, saying in a low voice, "It's a nuisance to be compelled to wear these, but I suppose I must exercise caution. One has always to bear the punishment of one's indiscretion." "Why?" He smiled grimly, but remained silent, even though he had admitted that he was not what he represented himself to be, even though I knew that he was an adventurer, and even though the dead man Arnold had urged me not to trust him implicitly, yet I somehow could not help liking him. He was always so full of quiet humor, and his small eyes twinkled merrily when those quaint remarks and caustic criticisms fell from his lips. "I thought that the danger which existed that evening in Totnes had passed," I remarked. "Only temporarily, I fear. Thanks to your generous aid, Kimball, I was able to slip through their fingers, as I have done on previous occasions. but I fear that the meshes of the net may one day be woven a trifle too closely. I shouldn't really care very much if it were not for Asta. You know how devoted I am to her," he added, leaning his arms upon the small table and bending towards me as he spoke. "And if any little contretemps did happen to you," I asked. "Asta would, alas, be left alone," he said in a low, hoarse voice. "Poor girl. I fear she would find a great change in her circumstances." It was upon the tip of my tongue to acknowledge as to him how madly I loved her, and of my intention of asking her to be my wife. Yet somehow I hesitated, fearing, I think, lest he might scorn such a proposition, for I remembered how, after all, she was his sole companion, and that without her he would be lonely and helpless. She was the one bright spot in his soured life, he had declared to me more than once. Though scarcely yet out of her teens, she directed the large household at Lidford with all the genius and economy of an experienced housewife. Yes, hers had been a strange career, the adopted daughter of a man who was so often compelled to go into hiding in strange guises and in strange places. "Let us hope nothing will happen," I said cheerfully. "Why should it?" His face broadened into a meaning grin, and he readjusted his hideous round spectacles and lit a fresh cigar. "Really, Mr. Shaw," I said, "your dark forebodings and your strange declarations puzzle me. True, I have endeavored to serve your interests, and I regard you as a friend, heedless of what I cannot help suspecting. Yet you are never open and frank with me concerning one thing, your friendship with Melville Arnold." He started at mention of the name, a fact which caused me to ponder. "I hardly follow you." "Well," I said, "shortly before leaving England, I received a visit from a certain Mrs. Olive, a lady living near Bath. I believe you know her." "Yes," he gasped, grasping the edge of the table and half rising from his seat. "Then she has seen you," he cried. "What does she tell you?" "Several things," I replied. "She alleges that you are not Arnold's friend, but his fiercest enemy." "She has told you that," he cried bitterly. "And what else has that woman said against me?" "Nothing much." "Come," he exclaimed boldly, "tell me, Kemble, man to man, all that woman has said." I saw that his manner had changed. His small eyes were flashing with fire, while upon his pale cheeks showed 2 scarlet patches. Through my brain surged recollections of the woman's allegations, but, seeing him in such anger, I did not desire to irritate him further. Therefore I declared that whatever the lady had said was in no way derogatory to him. "You are not telling me the truth, Kemble," he declared, looking straight into my eyes. "I know her too well. She has lied to you about me." "Probably," was my reply. "I happened by a curious chance to know the character of the lady, and it is hardly such as would inspire me with confidence." "You know her then?" he exclaimed, staring at me hard. "I know that at one time she passed as Lady Lettice Lancaster, and was sentenced to penal servitude as an adventuress." "Who told you that? How do you know that?" he asked quickly. "It is surely common knowledge," was my reply. "Therefore please dismiss from your mind that anything she might say to your detriment would impair our friendship." "Ah, yes," he cried suddenly, taking my hand and wringing it warmly. "I know, Kemble, that you, being my friend, will refuse to be influenced in any way by evil report. That woman is, as you rightly say, an unscrupulous adventuress. I knew her once, before her conviction, but I have since lost sight of her. Yet, I know she is my enemy, and, well, if it were to her interest, she would have no compunction in giving me away to Scotland Yard." "Then she is your enemy?" "My worst enemy." "Ah, then I understand the reason of her allegations," I said, and a moment later the subject dropped. We returned to the hotel just before midnight, and I ascended in the lift to my room. Shaw shook my hand and turned into his own room. From my window, I found that I commanded a wide view of the great place Carnot and the adjacent streets, picturesque with their many lights. I had not switched on my light and was standing gazing below when of a sudden I distinguished Shaw hurrying out of the hotel again and crossing the place towards the Pont du Midi, the iron bridge on the right which spans the Rhone. He had in a moment changed both hat and coat, I noticed, and therefore his sudden exit, after having led me to believe he was about to turn in, struck me as curious. So, without hesitation, I, too, slipped on another coat, and putting on a golf cap, descended in the lift, and was soon speeding away in the direction he had taken. When halfway across the bridge, I saw him walking slowly before me. Therefore, I held back and watched. I followed him across the river, when he suddenly turned to the left along the Quai Claude-Bernard, until at the foot of the next bridge, the Guillotière, he turned to the left along the Cours Gambetta until he came to a small square, the Place du Pont. There he suddenly halted beneath a lamp and glanced at his watch. Then he idled across to the corner of one of the half-dozen dark, deserted streets which converged there, as though awaiting someone. For a quarter of an hour he remained there calmly smoking, and quite unsuspicious of my proximity. But his patience was at last rewarded, because from the shadow there emerged a female figure in dark jacket and skirt, to which after a moment's hesitation he went forward with words of greeting. They met beneath the light of a street lamp, and from where I stood, hidden in a doorway, I was sufficiently close to get a view of her countenance. I held my breath. It was that of the woman who had stood in the dock of the Old Bailey and been convicted of fraud, the woman who now lived in such style at Ridgehill Manor, and who was known in Bath as Mrs. Olive. For a moment they stood there in the night, their hands clasped, neither uttering a single word. And yet Shaw had only an hour before declared her to be his most bitter and dangerous enemy. Chapter 19. Falling Shadows. I watched Shaw strolling slowly with the woman through the ill-lit back streets of Lyons, speaking rapidly with her. She, however, appeared to listen in silent obstinacy. He grew angry, yet she seemed to remain obdurate. She was dressed plainly in tweed skirt and blouse à la touriste, and wore a hat with a long veil in the fashion so often adopted by American women visiting Europe. They traversed the working-class district on the eastern side of the Rhone, where from behind the dingy red blinds of the cafes came the sounds of music and laughter, and where many groups of factory hands were idling about enjoying the cool night air. It was a noisy, bizarre district, which favored me, for I could watch the pair unobserved. At the corner of the place, Morand, they halted for a few moments, while he emphasized his words by striking his palm with his clenched fist, and she stood listening, her gaze turned towards the ground. Then, together, they crossed the big square to the left and traversed the bridge, passing beneath the deep shadows of the high, handsome Hôtel de Ville. Though at times I was quite near them, yet I could not, of course, catch a single word uttered by either. Only by their actions and gesticulations could I judge, and it appeared plain that she had met him under compulsion and was refusing to act as he desired. And yet he had only that very evening declared the woman to be his worst and most dangerous enemy. I reflected as I strode slowly on, keeping the two dark figures in sight. Shaw had, after all, never concealed from me the fact that he was wanted by the police for some offense. His sportsmanlike attitude, combined with his deep devotion to Asta, caused me involuntarily to like him. Perhaps it was because I loved her and he was her foster father, always kind, indulgent, and solicitous for her welfare, that I really held him in esteem, even though he might be an adventurer. Yet why had this woman Olive, as she now called herself, declared that Shaw had been Arnold's bitterest enemy? Surely it had been through my host himself that the woman knew of my existence, and my friendship with the dead man of mystery. But even while I watched them turn the corner by the Hôtel de Ville and stroll up that broad, deserted thoroughfare, in days so busy with its rows of fine shops, but now quiet and deserted, towards the Place Bellecour, my thoughts reverted to Asta, she who had lost her lover, but whom I had grown to love so truly and so well. Suddenly, I turned upon my heel and abandoned pursuit of the pair. What mattered it to me? Their affairs, whatever they might be, were their own. I loved Asta. Indeed, because of my deepening affection for her, I had accompanied them upon that tour, which had for its object my love's forgetfulness of the black tragedy which had so suddenly overshadowed her young life. Guy Nicholson had promised to reveal something to me in strictest confidence, but alas, his lips had been mysteriously closed before he had had opportunity. Closed by whom? I turned down upon the quays and, following the Rhone bank, was soon back at the hotel. I left my hat in my own room, and on entering our private sitting room found, to my delight, that Asta was still there. She had been reading and had just risen as I entered, for she stood by the pale green curtains of the window, holding a fold of them in her hand, and looking forth into the starlit night, her slim young figure clearly outlined against their dull soft green, a becoming rose flush upon her cheeks, her lips slightly parted, and her eyes bewitchingly bright. "I've been waiting for Dad, Mr. Kemble," she said. "Do you know where he is?" "Out, I think," was my reply. "I suppose he's smoking in one of the cafes. He believed that you had gone to bed, I expect." And I threw myself lazily into a chair. I thought that her eyes filled with tears as she turned back towards the long, open windows and gazed out into the place below. And I confess that this surprised me. "You are upset," I said softly, rising and standing at her side. "What's the matter, Miss Seymour? Tell me, confide in me, your friend." I hardly know," she faltered in a strange, hoarse voice. I took her hand and found it trembling. But what?" I asked. Her face was turned away from me towards the night. "Well," she said after a long pause, as though reluctant to tell me, "I fear that Dad has gone out to meet someone. When we arrived in this hotel, I saw among his letters a handwriting which I recognized. The writing of a woman, eh?" She started, turning to me quickly. "How did you know?" she gasped. "Well, I guessed," I laughed. "You guessed correctly. And I have suspicion that he has gone out tonight to meet her in secret, too." I waited for her to conclude her sentence, but her lips closed with a snap. The color had left her cheeks, while in her eyes was a strange, wild look of fear. "In confidence, Miss Seymour, I may as well tell you that I saw him half an hour ago walking with a lady, a person who lives near Bath under the name of Olive." "Then my suspicions are correct," she cried. "That woman has regained her power over him. My poor Dad. He has fallen into her clutches. Ah, Mr. Kemble, if you only knew all," she added. "If only I dare tell you." "Why not tell me? Surely I am your friend. You may trust me not to betray any secret," I said in deep earnestness. "They have met tonight. There is some mischief brewing. She is cruel, evil, and scrupulous. I know, and a convicted criminal." "You know her, then?" she asked quickly, looking into my eyes. "Yes, I am acquainted with Lady Lettice Lancaster, as she was once called, and I know that she was sentenced at the Old Bailey for a series of remarkably ingenious frauds." "Is she an associate of your father's?" "She was once, I believe, before her sentence," replied the girl. "She exercised over him a strange, incomprehensible fascination, as an evil woman so often can over a man. He acted at her bidding, and, while I know but little, Mr. Kemble, but alas, what I know is in itself too much, I am surprised that Dad, knowing the woman's character, should dare to again associate himself with her. She introduced me to her brother, George King. Do you know him?" "Yes. He sometimes passes as her brother, and sometimes as butler or chauffeur. But he is her husband, Henry Earnshaw, sometimes known as Whore. And your father assisted them in their frauds." "Eh? That is my supposition. I have no actual knowledge, for it was several years ago, when I was but a girl," was her reply. "And you fear that the outcome of the meeting tonight may be another mutual arrangement?" She nodded sadly in the affirmative. "The combination of Dad and these people would, indeed, be a formidable one," she said. If he would only take my advice, and in it all, he has sufficient to live upon comfortably. Why does he court disaster in this way? He has always been so very good to me, ever since I was a tiny child, that I cannot help loving him." I did not reply. What could I say? I longed to speak frankly to her and take her out of that atmosphere of evil. Yet what could I do? How could I act? "I have a suspicion that poor Mr. Arnold was a friend of that woman," I said a few moments later, as she stood against the table before me. "Yes," was her reply. "He was her friend and benefactor, I believe. He did all he could for her defense before the judge, but to no avail. Somebody betrayed her into the hands of the police. Dad told me so once. He believes it to have been her own husband, the man Earnshaw." I did not speak for a few moments. I was thinking of that strange letter which had threatened vengeance against the mysterious scholar, Mr. Arnold. The latter had been accused of what he had not done, Yet that very accusation had given me a clue to some very curious circumstances, and had forewarned me as to the true character of the wealthy widow of Ridgehill Manor. Has your father any ground for declaring the woman's conviction to be due to Earnshaw? Yes, I believe so, but he has never told anyone, except myself. But if he and Mrs. Olive become on friendly terms again, he will doubtless reveal what he knows. Probably. Then the man Earnshaw will turn against her, and against Dad also. In that lies the great peril for Dad, which I apprehend. I realized how far-seeing she was, how carefully she had weighed all the consequences, and how anxious she was for her father's safety. On the other hand, however, Shaw was certainly not a man to run any unnecessary risks. From what I had seen of him, he appeared full of craft and cunning, as became one who lived upon his wits. Tell me what you know concerning Mr. Arnold's association with this woman of 100 different names, I urged. I have a reason for my curiosity. I know but little. Once, when I was about 15, Dad and I traveled with Mr. Arnold from Vienna to Territet and met her at the Hotel des Alpes there. She was very affable and nice to me, and she told me what an excellent friend Mr. Arnold had been to her. I recollect the incident quite well, for on that day she bought me a little chain bracelet as a present. I have it now. Your father quarreled with Arnold, I believe? Yes, she said. They had some difference. I never, however, ascertained the real facts. He evidently wished to see me, for he wrote to me making an appointment. And when I went to the hotel for that purpose, I learnt, alas, that he was dead. Had he lived, his intention was to meet your father in secret at Totnes in Devonshire. Why in secret, I wonder? That same question has been puzzling me for a long time, Mr. Kemble, she said quickly. I have arrived at the conclusion that he feared lest Mrs. Olive might know of his arrival in England and set someone to watch his movements. He feared her. Then there may have been some reason why the woman desired that they should not meet. Apparently so. I reflected. Mrs. Olive now knew that I had borne a message to Shaw from the dead man who had destroyed a fortune. Did she fear its results? And was she, for that reason, holding out to Shaw the olive branch of peace? I suggested that to Asta, and she was inclined to agree with me. We must do what we can to break off your father's friendship with this woman, I declared. It is distinctly dangerous for him. Yes, Mr. Kemble, she cried. I only wish we could. I only wish. Her sentence was interrupted by a sound which startled both of us. We listened, looking into each other's serious face without uttering a word. The sound emanated from the next room, Shaw's bedroom, the door of which was closed. It was that low, peculiar whistle which I had first heard on the morning I had visited Titmarsh after poor Guy's mysterious death, and had heard on a second occasion when visiting at Lidford. There's Dad again, she cried in a strained voice. He evidently doesn't know we are still up. The whistle was again repeated, a low, long-drawn, peculiar sound in a high shrill note. It was not the unconscious whistle of a man thinking, but a sound full of meaning, a distinct call, which even as we listened in silence was repeated a third time. Chapter 20. The Man with the Crimson Button. Pale and startled, she raised her finger in a gesture of silence, and we both stole noiselessly from the room, closing the door behind us. Upon the thick carpet of the corridor we crept past Shaw's door, and Asta disappeared into her own chamber, which adjoined, while I went on to mine. I could not get that peculiar whistle out of my ears. It seemed as though it were a signal to somebody. Yet though I went back to Shaw's door and listened there for a full hour, I heard no sound of any movement. The room was in darkness, and he was, no doubt, already asleep. When I turned in, I lay a long time thinking over the reason of Shaw's friendship with the woman Olive. What Asta had told me only seemed to increase the mystery, rather than diminish it. I must have dropped off to sleep about 2 o'clock, puzzled and faggied out by the long hours on the road, when I was suddenly awakened by hearing a loud, shrill scream. I started up and listened. It was Asta's voice shrieking in terror. I sprang out into the corridor without a second's hesitation and rapped upon the door, crying, "What's the matter? Let me in." In a few seconds she unbolted the door, and opening it I encountered her in a pale pink robed chamber, her luxuriant chestnut hair falling about her shoulders. Her large dark brown eyes haggard and startled, her hands clenched, her countenance white to the lips. "What has happened, Miss Seymour?" I asked, glancing quickly around the room. I hardly know," she gasped in breathless alarm. Only," she whispered in a low voice, I've seen the hand of death again." "Seen it again?" I echoed, but she raised her finger and pointed to her father's door. "Tell me the circumstances," I whispered. "There is something very uncanny and unnatural about this which must be investigated. Last night it appeared to me 120 miles away, and now you see it tonight. Are you quite sure you saw it?" I asked the latter question because it was still dark, and she had switched on the electric light. I felt a cold, rough contact with my cheek, and waking saw the hand again. "I burn a nightlight, as you see," and she pointed across to a child's nightlight in a saucer upon the washstand. "And it vanished as before?" "Instantly. I thought I heard a slight sound afterwards, but I must have been mistaken." "Yes," I said, making a quick examination of the room and looking beneath the bed. "There is certainly nothing here." I noted that the communicating door between her room and her father's was still secured by the small brass bolt. "Well," I declared, "it is utterly inexplicable." My voice evidently awakened Shaw, for we heard him tap at the door and ask in a deep, drowsy voice, "What's the matter in there, Asta?" "Oh, nothing at all, Dad," was the girl's reply. "Only I fancy there must be a rat in my room, and Mr. Kimball is looking for it." "Didn't you scream?" he asked wearily. "Yes," I said, as she unbolted the door, and her father entered. Miss Seymour's scream woke me up. "Did you see the rat?" Shaw asked me. "No." I laughed, in an endeavor to conceal our fear. "I expect if there is one it has got away down its hole. I've searched, but can find nothing." "Ah," growled the man, awakened from his sleep. "That's the worst of these confounded continental hotels. Most of them are overrun with vermin. I've often had rats in my room. Well, dear," he added, turning to Asta, "go to bed again and leave your electric light on. They won't come out then." The girl and I exchanged glances, and after a hearty laugh at the frightened spectacle we all three presented, we again parted, and I returned to my room. What was the meaning of that inexplicable apparition of a hand? Why had the dying man warned me of it? I could quite see Asta's reluctance to tell her father what she had seen, knowing well how he, plain, matter-of-fact man, would laugh at her and declare that she had been dreaming. But it was no dream. I myself had seen the thing with my own eyes, while my own cheek only a few hours before had borne witness to its actual existence. I saw how horrified she was at its reappearance, and what a terrible impression it had produced upon her already overwrought nerves. I knew that she would not again retire that night, and indeed, feeling that some unknown evil was present, I slipped on my clothes and spent the remainder of the night in an armchair, reading a French novel. Dawn came at last, and as soon as the sun rose, I descended and went out for a long, invigorating walk beside the Rhone. On my return, I met Asta strolling alone under the trees in the place near the hotel, and referred to the weird incident of the night. "Ah, Mr. Kimball, please do not recall it," she implored. "It is too horrible. I can't make out what it can be, except that it is a sign to us of impending evil." "A sign to us both," I said. "But whom are we to fear? Perhaps that woman. Is she still in Lyons, I wonder?" "Probably. About 7 o'clock this morning, Dad sent an express message to somebody. He called a waiter, and I heard him give the letter with instructions that it was to be sent at once. I said nothing, but half an hour later, by the judicious application of half a louis to the floor waiter, I ascertained that the note had been sent to a Madame Trelawney at the Hotel du Globe in the Place Bellecour. Trelawney was, I recollected, one of the names used by the pseudo-Lady Lettice Lancaster. Therefore, after my café au lait, I excused myself, stepped over to the hotel, and there ascertained that Madame, who had been there for 2 days, had received the note, packed hurriedly, and an hour later had left the Perrache station by the Paris Express. On returning, I told Asta this, and at 11 o'clock we were again on the white, dusty highway, that beautiful road through deep valleys and over blue mountains the Route d'Italie, which runs from Lyons through quiet old Chabris to Modane and the Alpine frontier. In Chabris, however, we turned to the left, and ere long found ourselves in that scrupulously clean and picturesque summer resort of the wealthy Aix-les-Bains. Shaw, who was in the best of spirits, had laughed heartily over Asta's adventure with the rat, and as we arrived at our destination, he turned to me, expressing a hope that we all three would enjoy a real good time. I had been in Aix several years before and knew the life. The Bains, the casino, the Villa de Fleurs, the fêtes, and the boating on the Lac du Bourget, that never-ending round of gaiety amid which the wealthy idler may pass the days of warm sunshine. And certainly the 3 weeks we spent at the old-fashioned Europe, in preference to a newer and more garish hotel, were most delightful. I found myself ever at Asta's side, and noted that her beauty was everywhere remarked. She was always smartly but neatly dressed, for Shaw was apparently most generous in the matter of gowns, some of which had come from a well-known dressmaker in the Place Vendôme. I wondered sometimes, as we sat together in the big salle, on manger or idled together under the trees in the pretty garden, whether she still thought of poor Guy Nicholson, or whether she was really pleased when alone with me. One fact was quite plain, that the visit had wrought a beneficial change in her. Her large dark eyes were again full of life and sparkle, and her lips smiled deliciously, showing how she enjoyed the brightness and gaiety of life. Shaw had met accidentally at the Grand Circle a Frenchman he knew named Count Dory, who had a chateau on the edge of the lake, and one day he went over to visit him, leaving us to have luncheon together alone. As we sat on the veranda of the hotel to take our coffee afterwards, I glanced at her. Never had I seen her looking so charming. She was entirely in cream serge, relieved with the slightest touches of pale blue, with a large white hat, long white gloves, and white shoes, the personification of summer itself. Ah, yes, she was exquisite, I told myself. Yet how strange that she should be the adopted daughter of a man who, though actually a justice of the peace, was nevertheless an undesirable. Time after time had I tried to induce her to reveal to me the reason why Shaw went in such terror of arrest. But she would not betray his secret. For that I admired her, for was she not devoted to him? Did she not owe everything to his kindness and his generosity? Like many another man, I suppose he had been fooled or tricked by a woman, and had, in consequence, to lead a celibate life. In order to bring brightness and youth into his otherwise dull home, he had adopted little Asta as his daughter. We had been speaking of a forthcoming fate on the following day, when, of a sudden, she turned in her chair towards me, and with a calm, serious look upon her face said, "Do you know, Mr. Kemble, I am greatly worried." "Over what?" I asked quickly. "Well, this morning, when I was walking back from the milliner's, I saw Earnshaw, that woman's husband. Fortunately, he did not see me, but she is, I suspect, here in Aix-les-Bains. Why should you fear, even if she is?" I asked. Well, I really do not know," she faltered. "Only, to tell you in confidence, I believe some evil work is in progress, some base conspiracy." "What causes you to suspect that? You do not believe that your father is implicated in it?" "How can I tell?" she exclaimed in a hoarse whisper. "I am filled with fear always, knowing in what peril he continually exists." "I know," I said. "Why he does not act more judiciously, I cannot think. At home, at Lidford, he is surely unsuspected and in security. I'm always telling him so, but alas, he will not listen. You said that he is now under the influence of that woman." "I fear so," was her low reply, as she sighed despairingly. We rose and strolled out together to the car, which was waiting to take us for a run over the hills and among the mountains by the Pont de l'Arcale to Geneva, 70 kilometers distant. The afternoon was glorious, and as we sat side by side, we chatted and laughed merrily, both of us forgetting all our apprehensions and our cares. Ah, yes, those days were truly idyllic days, for I loved her devotedly, and each hour I passed in her society, the bond became stronger and more firmly forged. But could she reciprocate my affection? That was the great and crucial question I had asked myself, 1,000 times. I dared not yet reveal to her the secret of my heart, for even still she thought and spoke of that honest, upright fellow whose untimely end was so enshrouded in mystery. We dined at Geneva, in the huge salle, a manger of the Beau Rivage, which overlooked the beautiful lake, tranquil and golden in the sunset, with Mont Blanc, towering and snow-capped, showing opposite against the clear evening sky. We strolled for half an hour on the terrace, where the English tourists were taking their coffee after dinner, and then, in the fading twilight, Harris drove us back again to Ike's, where we arrived about 10 o'clock, after a day long to be remembered. Asta held my hand for a moment in the hall, raising her splendid eyes to mine, and then wishing me good night, mounted in the lift to her room. Afterwards, I went along to the fumoir to find Shaw, but could not discover him. Later, however, the hall porter said he had complained of feeling unwell and had gone to his room. I threw myself into a cane chair in the hall and lit a cigar, for it was yet early. I suppose I must have remained there perhaps half an hour when a waiter brought me a note. Tearing it open, I found in it a scribbled message in pencil from Asta. "There is danger, as I suspected," she wrote. "Be careful. Do not approach us, and know nothing. Destroy this. Asta." I crushed the letter in my pocket and dismissed the servant. What could it mean? Not more than a quarter of an hour later, as I still sat smoking and pondering, a tall, dark-bearded, pale-faced, rather elegant-looking Frenchman, wearing the crimson button of the Legion d'honneur in his coat, entered the hall from the street, and glancing round quickly, advanced to the bureau. A moment later he came towards me and, halting, bowed and exclaimed in good English, "Pardon, monsieur, but I have the honor to speak with Monsieur Kemble." "Is that not so?" "That is my name," I replied. "I have something of importance to communicate to monsieur," he said, very politely, holding his gray felt hat in his hand and glancing quickly around. "May I speak with you privately?" "Certainly," I replied, and recollecting a small salon off the hall on the left, led the way thither and switched on the light. Then, when he had carefully closed the door and we were alone, he said with a pleasant smile, "I had perhaps better at once introduce myself to monsieur. I am Victor Tramu, inspector of the 1st Division of the Brigade Mobile of Paris, and I have called at the risk of inconveniencing you to put a few questions concerning 2 associates of yours living in this hotel, namely, Monsieur Harvey Shaw and Mademoiselle Asta Seymour." "Associates," I echoed resentfully. "They are my friends." The police officer smiled as he caressed his silky brown beard, a habit of his. "Excellent. Then certainly you will be able to give me the information I require." "Of what?" "Of their recent movements, and more especially of their place of residence." I was silent, recollecting Asta's injunctions to know nothing, but the man stood regarding me with calm, searching, impudent glance. "By what right, pray, do you subject me to this cross-examination?" I demanded in French, full of resentment, as I stood in the center of the room facing him. "Ah, so monsieur is disinclined to betray his friends," laughed Tramu, whom I afterwards found out to be one of the most famous detectives in France. "You arrived in automobile from Lyons together, and previously from Versailles," he remarked. "In Lyons your friend Shaw met other of his associates, and again here, yesterday at the Villa Ryssac. You see, I know a good deal of what has transpired and what is just now in progress. Indeed, I traveled from Paris for that purpose." "Well, it surely does not concern me," I exclaimed. "Pardon, I must differ from monsieur," he said, bowing slightly, his hands behind his back. "I desire to know something concerning these persons, of where they live." "You had better ask them yourself," I replied. "It is scarcely likely that I shall give information to the police concerning my friends," I added in defiance. "Bien, then shall I be frank with you, monsieur? The fact is that we have suspicions, very grave ones, but we are not absolutely certain of their identity." "Then why trouble me?" "Because you can so easily establish it beyond a doubt." "Well, Monsieur Tramu, I flatly refuse to satisfy your curiosity or assist you against my friends," I replied, and turned abruptly upon my heel to leave the room. "Then it is to be regretted. In that case, Monsieur Kemble, You must please consider yourself under arrest as an accomplice and associate of the two individuals in question, he said, very coolly but determinedly. And as he uttered the words, two men, police officers in plain clothes, who had evidently been listening without, opened the door unceremoniously and entered the apartment. The situation was both startling and unexpected. I was now faced with a most difficult problem. I was under arrest. My silence had cost me my liberty. Asta and her stepfather must also have both already fallen into the hands of the police, for were they not upstairs? Truly, the coup had been very swiftly and cleverly effected, as it seemed were all coups made by the renowned Tramu, the trusted lieutenant of Monsieur Hammer to the Charite in Paris. The misfortune so long dreaded by Asta had, alas, fallen. What must the result be? What indeed? What could be the charge against them? Chapter 21. More mystery. Ignorant of the fate of my friends, I was unceremoniously bundled into a fiacre and driven to the police bureau, where for nearly 3 hours I was closely questioned regarding my own identity and my knowledge of Harvey Shaw. Aix-les-Bains being a gambling center, it attracts half the escrocs in Europe. Hence, stationed here, and there are several of the smartest and shrewdest police officials which France possesses. At the hands of Victor Tramu and 2 of his colleagues, I was subjected to the closest interrogation in a small bare room with threadbare carpet and walls painted dark green, the headquarters of the Charite in that district. The population of Aix in summer is much the same as that of Monte Carlo in winter, a heterogeneous, cosmopolitan collection of wealthy pigeons and hawks of both sexes and all nationalities. From the 1,001 questions with which I fenced, I tried to gather the nature of the offense of which Harvey Shaw was culpable, but all to no avail. I asked Trauma point blank if he and his foster daughter had been arrested, but no information would he give. I'm asking questions. Not you, monsieur, was his cold reply. All the interrogation seemed directed towards ascertaining the hiding place of Shaw in England. You knew him in England, remarked Tramu, seated at a table upon which was a telephone instrument, while I stood between the 2 agents of police who had arrested me. Where did you first meet him? At a railway station. Under what circumstances? I had a message to deliver, a letter from a dead friend. Tramu smiled incredulously, as did also the 2 other officials at his side. And this dead friend, who was he? Asked the renowned detective. A man whom I had met on a steamer between Naples and London. He was a stranger to me, but being taken ill on board, I tried to do what I could for him. He died in London soon after our arrival. His name? Melville Arnold. Victor Tramu stroked his brown beard. Arnold, he repeated. Melville Arnold, an English name. He was an Englishman, of course. Certainly. Arnold, he repeated, gazing blankly across the room. And he was a friend of the suspect Shaw? Eh? I presume so. Arnold, he again repeated reflectively, as though the name recalled something to his memory. Was he an elderly, gray-haired man who had lived a great deal in Egypt and was an expert in Egyptology? He was. Tramu sprang to his feet, staring at me, utterly amazed. And he is dead, you say? He died in my presence. Arnold, he cried, turning to his colleagues. Oh, yes. I remember now. I recollect. A most remarkable and mysterious male. What colossal brain, what knowledge, what a staunch friend, and what a formidable enemy. And he is, alas, dead. Describe to me the circumstances in which he died, Monsieur Kemble, he added, in a voice full of regret and sympathy. In response, I briefly told him the story, much as I have related it in these pages, while all listened attentively. And he actually compelled you to burn the banknotes? Asked the officer of the Charite. He willfully destroyed his fortune, the money which I had hoped to recover, the money which he... But no, he is dead, so we need say no more. Then you knew poor Arnold, Monsieur Tramu? I remarked. Quite well, laughed the brown-bearded man seated at the table. For years the police of Europe searched for him in vain. He was far too wary and clever for us. Instead of enjoying the pleasures of the capitals, he preferred the desert and his studies of Egyptian antiques. He moved about so quickly and with so many precautions that we never could lay hands upon him. Indeed, It is said that he kept 2 ex-agents of police whose duty it was to watch us and keep him informed regarding our movements. His was indeed a mastermind, a greater man than your associate, Harvey Shaw. What were the charges against Arnold? I asked eagerly. Why were you so anxious to secure his arrest? Oh, there were a dozen different charges, he replied. But now he is dead. Let his memory as a very remarkable man rest in peace. Our present action concerns the man Shaw. Where did you visit him in England? He visited me at my house, Upton End. And you did not visit him? I saw him twice at the Carlton Hotel in London, and once at the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool. And you declare that you have no knowledge of his offenses? Asked the official shrewdly. If I had, I certainly should not have accepted his invitation to come here on a motor tour, was my quick reply. And the girl? You mean to say that you have no suspicion of her offense? Her offense? I cried. Tell me, I beg of you to tell me, what allegation there is against her. Ah, my dear monsieur, of that you will know soon enough, replied the detective, again stroking his beard. I fear that, if your ignorance of the truth is not feigned, the revelations forthcoming will, well, greatly astonish you. But surely mademoiselle is not a criminal, I cried, staring at him in dismay. Wait and hear the evidence against her. I will not believe it. Because you are enamored of her, Monsieur Kemble, exclaimed the great detective, with a shrewd twinkle in his large brown eyes. A man is always loath to believe that his well-beloved can do wrong. Bien, I urge you to wait and see what the revelations bring forth, to carefully weigh over the hideous story before giving further thought to her. I need no advice. Monsieur, I protested angrily. If you make allegations, you should surely tell me their nature. That is for you to discover, he answered with a crafty smile. You have refused to assist me. Therefore I, in turn, refuse to satisfy your curiosity. You have arrested me because I happen to be on friendly terms with this man and his daughter. Therefore surely I may be told the offense alleged against them. I protested in anger. The fact you have revealed, namely, that Shaw and Melville Arnold were friends, is quite sufficient to prove what I really suspected. The man's identity is made entirely plain, even though you refuse to give me information. They're my friends, I remarked resentfully. Perhaps they will be so no longer when you know the actual truth concerning them, he said, smiling grimly. And what is this terrible charge against them, pray? Have I not already told you that you will know quite soon enough, was the prompt reply of the renowned detective, whose name was as a household word in France, and his 2 companions smiled. The telephone bell rang, and one of them took up the receiver and listened. Then he handed it to Trameau, who, from his words, I gathered, was speaking with the commissary of police at the Gare du Lion in Paris, asking that an incoming train should be carefully watched. Thank you. Advise me as soon as it arrives, he added, and placing the receiver down, he rang off. Again he returned to the attack, endeavoring to discover from me where in England Shaw had hidden himself. But I was just as evasive as he was himself. I was fighting for the woman I loved. I told him vaguely that they lived in the north of England in order to mislead him, but I declared I did not know their actual place of residence. But he only smiled incredulously, replying, Monsieur is enamored of mademoiselle. I have watched you both for 2 days past, and I know that you are aware of her address in England. This man had actually been watching us, while we had been all unconscious of espionage. Fierce anger again rose within me. I admitted to myself that I had acted foolishly in associating with a man whom I knew to be a fugitive from justice. But it certainly never occurred to me that I might be subjected to such an ordeal as that I was undergoing. Alternatively threatening, coaxing, warning, and gesticulating, Trameau, a past master in the art of interrogation, cross-examined me until the first rose flush of dawn showed through the window. But he obtained nothing more from me. I told him frankly that, as he refused to give me any information, I, on my part, would remain dumb. His annoyance was apparent. He had expected me to meekly relate all I knew, but instead he found that I could be as evasive in my answers as he was clever in putting his questions. In turn, quite half a dozen police officials entered the room and regarded me with considerable curiosity, until in anger I cried, "This action of yours, Monsieur Trameau, is disgraceful. I know this is your abominable French police system, but I demand that word of my arrest be sent to the British consul, with whom I shall lodge complaint." "My dear monsieur," laughed the man with the tiny red button in his lapel, "that will be quite unnecessary. I think at this late hour we may now dispense with your further presence. You are free to go." And addressing a man in uniform, he added, "Bring in the chauffeur." I turned upon my heel and left the room, but as I went along the corridor, I saw at the farther end Harris seated between two uniformed officers. Surely they would obtain no information from him, for he had only been engaged for the tour, and knew nothing further of Harvey Shaw or of Asta, except, he might know their address at Lidford. So I shouted along the corridor to him, "Harris, don't tell them Mr. Shaw's address in England, whatever you do." "Right you are, sir," he replied cheerily. "This is a funny job, ain't it, sir? They arrested me in bed. Where's Mr. Shaw?" "Don't know, sir. I suppose he and Miss Asta are in here somewhere," was his reply, as they ushered him into the room where the great trauma awaited him. On my return to the hotel, the sleepy night porter admitted me. No, he had seen nothing of Monsieur Shaw or of Mademoiselle. Hastily, I ascended the stairs to our suite of apartments, but they were not there. The beds had not been slept in, but their baggage had been piled up, evidently by the police, in readiness for removal and examination. The drawers and wardrobes had evidently been searched after their arrest, for the rooms were in great disorder. In my own room, during my absence, everything had been turned topsy-turvy. The lock of my steel dispatch box had been broken, and its contents turned out upon the bed. In France, when the police make a domiciliary visit, they certainly do it most thoroughly. Was it possible that in examining the effects of Shaw and Asta the police had ascertained the address of their hiding place in England? I stood in the center of the room, gazing at the heap of papers and letters upon the bed, apprehensive and bewildered. Returning below, I induced the big Swiss night porter to rouse the manager, and some 10 minutes later the latter came to me in trousers and coat, evidently not in a very good humor at being disturbed. He seemed surprised to see me there, and I said with a laugh, "I suppose you believed I had been arrested?" "Well," he replied, "the police took you away." "For interrogation only," I replied. "But I am in search of my friends." "And the police are in search of them also, I believe," he replied abruptly. "It does no good to the reputation of the hotel to have such visitors, monsieur." "Then they have not been arrested," I cried in delight. "No, Mademoiselle, I believe, must have recognized the inspector of the Charite from Paris as she was coming downstairs. She rushed back and told her father, and hastily seizing her dressing case, while he took a small bag, they both descended the service stairs and made their exit by the back premises. There was a door below, which is always kept locked, but Monsieur Shaw had somehow provided himself with a key in case of emergency, for we found it in the lock. When the police, after arresting you, went upstairs to take the pair, they found they had already flown. They must have rushed down to the station and caught the Paris night express, which was due just about the time they would arrive there. "And the police are furious," I said. "They must be. They have, I believe, just missed a most important capture." "What was the charge against them?" I inquired. They would not tell me," was his reply. "They seem to be acting with great caution and secrecy. They made a careful examination of everything, and only left about 3/4 of an hour ago." And with that I was compelled to remain satisfied. Chapter 22. The Secret of Harvey Shaw. For 3 days I remained in Aix, awaiting some news or message from the fugitives, but none came. Trameau called and saw me twice, evidently astounded at the channel of escape which Shaw had so cunningly prepared. He had, no doubt, obtained an impression of one of the servants' master keys, and had one cut to fit the locked door, which prevented visitors from passing out by any other way save by the front hall. He had anticipated that flight might be necessary, and the fact that he had prepared for it showed that he was both cunning and fearless. Asta's injunctions to me to say nothing showed plainly that they intended still to keep their hiding place a secret. And if Shaw was the adventurer I believed, it was not likely that either he or she would carry anything by which to reveal their more respectable identity. So at length, full of grave apprehensions, I left Ike's, sickened by its music and summer gaiety, and traveled home, halting one night at the Grand in Paris, and duly arrived at the Cecil in London. There I found a batch of letters sent on to me from Upton End, and among them was a formal letter from a firm of solicitors called Napier and Norman, 129, Bedford Row, W.C., stating that they were acting for the late Mr. Guy Nicholson of Titmarsh Court, and asking me to call upon them without delay. Exercising caution lest I should be watched, I had immediately on arrival telephoned from my hotel bedroom to Lidford, but the response came back in a woman's voice that the master and Miss Asta were still abroad. Therefore, about noon on the morning following my return, I went round to Bedford Row in a taxi, and was quickly shown into the somber private room of an elderly, quiet-spoken man, Mr. George Napier, head of the firm. "I'm extremely glad you have called, Mr. Kemble," he said, as he leaned back in his chair. "I believe you were present at Titmarsh very soon after the unfortunate death of our client, Mr. Guy Nicholson. Indeed, I remember now that we met at the inquest. Well, Mr. Nicholson, with his father and grandfather before him, entrusted his affairs in our hands, and, naturally, after his decease, we searched his effects for any papers that were relative to his estate, or any private papers which should not fall into anybody's hands. Among them we found this letter, sealed just as you see it, and addressed to you. He evidently put aside, intending to post it in the morning, but expired in the night. And, taking a letter from a drawer in his writing table, he handed it across to me. I glanced at the superscription, and saw that it was addressed, ready for the post, and that a stamp was already upon it. Poor Nicholson's death was a most mysterious one, I exclaimed, looking the solicitor full in the face. I don't believe that he died from natural causes. Well, I fear we cannot get away from the medical evidence, replied the matter-of-fact, gray-faced man, peering through his spectacles. Of course, the locked door was a most curious circumstance, yet it may be accounted for by one of the servants, in passing before retiring, turning the key. Or, as you suggested at the inquest, the servant who entered the library in the morning may have thought the door was locked. It might have caught somehow, as locks sometimes do. I shook my head dubiously, and with eager fingers tore open the message from the dead. From its date, it had evidently been written only a few hours prior to his untimely end, and it read, "Strictly private. Dear Mr. Kemble, I fear, owing to the fact that I have promised Asta to take her motoring on Sunday, that I may not be able to keep my appointment with you. Since my confidential conversation with you, I have watched and discovered certain things at Lidford which cause me the keenest apprehension. Shaw is not what he pretends to be, and many of his movements are most mysterious. By dint of constant watching both while I haven't guessed there, and also by night, when they have believed me to be safely at home, I have ascertained several very remarkable facts. First, in secret and unknown to any, even to his gardeners, he sets clever traps for small birds, which he visits periodically at night, and takes away the unfortunate creatures he finds therein. Secondly, he is in the habit of going forth in the night and walking through Wolden woods to a spot close to Geddington village, at the corner of the road from Newton, and they're meeting a middle-aged man who frequently stops at the inn. Once I followed them and overheard some of their conversation. They were planning something, but what I could not make out. However, I feel sure that they both discover my presence, and hence he seems in fear of me and annoyed whenever I visit Lidford. Thirdly, in his bedroom, there is a cupboard beside the fireplace. The door is enameled white, and at first is not distinguishable from the rest of the paneling. Examine it, and you will see that it is secured by two of the most expensive and complicated of modern locks. What does that cupboard contain? The contents are not plate or valuables, for there is a large fireproof safe downstairs. Some mystery lies there. Fourthly, though he makes most clever pretenses of devotion to Asta, he hates her. Poor girl, she loves him and cannot see those black, covert looks he so often gives her when her back is turned. But I have seen them, and I know, at least I have guessed, the reason. Fifthly, if you are a frequent guest there, you will hear him sometimes utter a strange, shrill whistle for no apparent purpose, as though he does it quite unknowingly. But it is with a purpose. What purpose? I feel that Asta is in danger, and it is therefore my duty to protect her and elucidate the mystery of the strange conspiracy which I feel convinced is now in progress. It is to discuss these matters and to combine to keep vigilant watch that I am anxious to spend a few hours with you. Think carefully over these 5 points, and if I am unable to come on Sunday, I will motor over on Monday about 11 in the morning. Meanwhile, be careful not to show that you either know or suspect anything. I know Shaw suspects me, and therefore by some means I must remove his suspicions. That, however, will be a matter for us to discuss seriously when we meet. Asta has told me of a strange and extremely weird incident which occurred to her one night a little while ago in the house of a friend. The apparition of a black shadowy hand. I believe I have the solution of the mystery, a most remarkable and terrible one. I ask your assistance in this affair, and am eager to meet you to discuss it fully. Kindly destroy this letter to yours very sincerely, Guy Nicholson. I sat dumbfounded. It was just as I had believed. The man struck down so suddenly had discovered the actual truth. He had watched in patience and learned some strange and startling facts. The reference to the hand filled my mind with the hideous recollection of what I had seen in that roadside inn at Arnold-le-Duc, and of Arnold's strange warning. Who was Harford? The name I was to remember. Asta had told her lover of her own experience, and he had solved the mystery, yet he had not been spared to reveal it to me. His lips had been closed by death. The name of Harford was still unknown to me. How long I sat there staring at the closely written letter in my hand, I know not. But I was awakened to a consciousness of where I was by Mr. Napier's quiet voice exclaiming, "I see that my late client's letter has made a great impression upon you, Mr. Kemble. I presume it is of a purely private character." "Purely private," I managed to reply. "It does not concern his affairs in any way whatsoever, and it is marked strictly private." "Oh, very well. I, of course, have no wish whatever to inquire into your private affairs with my dead client," replied the solicitor. "I believe that it might contain something important, and for that reason hesitated to send it through the post." "Yes," I said meaningly, "it does contain something important, very important, Mr. Napier. Had this been placed in my hand in time, my poor friend's life might have been saved." "What do you mean?" he asked quickly, staring at me across the table. "Have you evidence of foul play?" "No evidence, but I find a distinct motive. Anything upon which we could work in order to bring the culprit to justice. If Mr. Nicholson did not really die a natural death—" "I tell you he did not," I cried angrily. "The village jury were impressed by the medical evidence, as all rustic juries are. Your client, Mr. Napier, discovered another man's secret, and the latter took steps to close his lips. But can you prove this? Can you name the man?" "Yes," I said, "I can name the man, and one day I shall prove it." "You can. Why not place the matter in the hands of the police, together with what is revealed in that letter?" he suggested. "Allow me to act. I shall act myself. At present, it is not a matter for the police. Certain facts have come to my knowledge which, if told at Scotland Yard, would not be believed. Therefore, at present, I intend to keep my knowledge strictly to myself. And replacing the dead man's message in its envelope, I put it safely into my breast pocket, and, taking leave of the solicitor, was soon in my taxi whirling along Holborn. Why had Nicholson suspected that Shaw's affection for his foster daughter was only feigned? Why did he allege that Shaw hated her? Why was he in such mortal terror lest some evil should befall her? Perhaps, after all, in watching so closely he had, as is so easy, discovered certain circumstances and misjudged them. For certainly, as far as I could see, Shaw was entirely devoted to the girl who had been his constant companion ever since her childhood days. Nevertheless, that strange letter, penned by the man whose intention it had been to reveal to me the secret of the weird shadow of the night, had caused me to determine to continue the vigil which had been so abruptly ended. I, too, would watch closely as soon as I learned of their hiding place, as closely as the dead man had done. If Asta were in actual peril, then I would stand as her protector in place of the upright, honest young fellow who, it seemed, had lost his life in the attempt. But the days, nay weeks, went on. September ended, and October came with rain and chilly wind. And though I returned to Upton End and frequently made inquiry over the telephone to Lidford, yet though I wrote to Davis at the poste restante at Charing Cross, I could learn no news of them. They had descended those back stairs of the hotel at Ike's and disappeared as completely as though the earth had swallowed them up. One day in the middle of October, with sudden resolve to carry out Nicholson's injunction to investigate, I drove over to Lidford, and on arrival, about noon, found all smart and well kept as though its owner were in residence. I told a rather lame story to the housekeeper, who, knowing me, came to me in the long, chintz-covered drawing room, the blinds of which were down. She had not heard from her master for a month past, the pleasant-faced woman explained. He was then in Ike's. I said that I had left him there and returned to England, and was now anxious to discover where he was. Then, after a brief chat, I exhibited my left forefinger enveloped in an old glove, and told her that on my way I had some engine trouble and had hurt my finger. I believe Mr. Shaw keeps up in his room a small medicine chest, I said, for I recollected that he once told me that he kept one there. I wonder if I might go up and try and find a piece of bandage. Certainly, replied Mrs. Howard, and she led me upstairs to the apartment over the drawing room, which I had come to Lidford for the purpose of examining. It was a large, airy, and well-furnished room, with a big bookcase at one end and a canary in a cage at the window. Without much difficulty, she discovered the small black Japan box, containing various surgical drugs and bandages, and I at once sent her down to obtain a small bowl of warm water. Then, the instant she had gone, I sought for the cupboard indicated by the dead man's letter. Yes, it was there, a long, narrow cupboard beside the fireplace, secured by two large locks of a complicated character, such as one finds on safe or strong-room doors. I bent and examined them thoroughly. The bed, I noticed, was set so that the eyes of anyone lying in it would be upon that door. What secret could be concealed there? What had the dead man suspected? What indeed? Chapter 23. A foreigner. I remained a long time attending to my damaged finger, which in reality had been injured a week before, at the same time thoroughly investigating the missing man's apartment. Except for the cupboard, secured so mysteriously by those combination locks, there was nothing extraordinary about it. The outlook was pleasant across the wide, undulating park, and the chairs with soft cushions and couch showed plainly that Harvey Shaw loved to take his ease. In no hurry to depart, I chatted affably to Mrs. Howard, wandering about the big, old-fashioned home into regions I had never been before. Poor Mr. Nicholson used to stay here sometimes, didn't he? I inquired presently, in a casual way. Oh, yes, sir. The master used to delight in having the poor young gentleman here, sir. He used to have the blue room, nearly opposite Mr. Shaw's, the one which looks out over the front drive. Poor Mr. Nicholson. We all like him so much. Wasn't it sad, sir? Very sad indeed, I said. The blow must nearly have broken Miss Asta's heart. It did, sir. At first, I thought the poor child would have gone out of her mind. She was so devoted to him. Mr. Shaw was also very fond of him. I know, for I once heard him say that he was the only man he would choose as Miss Asta's husband. What did he say that? He was sitting in the smoking room with a friend of his, one of the justices, Sir Gilbert Campbell, one evening after dinner, about a fortnight before the poor young gentleman died. I happened to be passing and overheard his words. I pondered for a moment. Either Shaw was a past master in the art of preparing a coup, or else Guy's surmises were wrong. Here, in the intimacy of the family, it was declared that Shaw was devoted to Asta. Certainly my own observations went to confirm that supposition. I wonder who knows Mr. Shaw's whereabouts. I said presently, I want to communicate with him upon a very important matter. Well, sir, it's very funny that he hasn't written to me. He's never been silent so long before. How long have you been with him? Oh, about 3 years now, sir. Then together we descended the broad oak staircase, and I went forth into the beautiful gardens chatting with the old white-bearded head gardener, and going through the grape and peach houses, all of which were most perfectly kept. How strange, I reflected. What would this large staff of superior servants think if they knew the truth, that their master, a man of mystery, was a fugitive from justice, that he and Asta had crept down the back stairs of an hotel and disappeared in the night while the police had entered from the front. As I drove back in the evening through those autumn-tinted lanes, with smiling meadows everywhere, I calmly reviewed the situation. After all, there was really no actually mysterious fact in Harvey Shaw having in his bedroom a cupboard so securely locked. He, upon his own admission, led a double life. Therefore, it was only to be supposed that he possessed a good many papers, even articles of clothing, perhaps, which he was compelled to hide from the prying eyes of his servants. I recalled the whole of Guy's letter, and found that the chief point was the fact that he had solved the weird mystery of that strange hand, that shadowy something which I myself had witnessed, and against which I had been warned by Arnold. What was it? But I put aside the puzzle. My chief thought was of Asta. Where could she be? Why had she not sent me word in secret of her hiding place? She had, by tacit agreement, accepted me as her friend, hence I was disappointed at receiving no word from her. That night, after reading my London paper over a cigar, as was my habit, I left the library about 11 o'clock and retired to my room. I must have been sound asleep when, of a sudden, the electrical alarm which my father years ago had placed upon the door of the big safe in the library for greater security went off with a tremendous clatter, and I jumped up, startled. Taking my revolver from a drawer in the dressing table, I rang the bell in the servants' quarters and switched on my electric hand lamp. But already the household was alarmed, and the dogs were barking furiously at the intruders, whoever they were. Accompanied by my man Adams, I descended the front stairs and, revolver in hand, entered the library, the window of which stood open, while below the safe door there lay upon the carpet a cheap bullseye lantern with 2 cylinders containing gas and some other paraphernalia, showing that the thieves were men of scientific method, for their intention had, I saw, been to use the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. The heads of some of the rivets had been removed, and a small hole drilled through the chilled steel 3/4 of an inch thick. All had gone well until they had touched the handle of the safe door, which had set off the alarm, the existence of which they had never suspected. Then their only safety lay in flight, and they had escaped, leaving behind them the objects I have enumerated. Adams telephoned for the police, while Tucker came up from the lodge, and I let loose the dogs and went outside into the drive. But, unfortunately, the thieves were already safely away, and were not likely to be caught, for in response to the telephonic message I was told that the rural constable was out on his beat, and was not expected back for another couple of hours. We 3 men, with several of the maidservants, stood outside on the lawn discussing the affair with bated breath in the dead stillness of the night, when, of a sudden, we distinctly heard in the far distance down in the valley beyond the Kings with the starting of a motor car and the gradual faintness of the sound as it receded along the high road. "There they go!" I cried. They came in a car, and it was awaiting them at the foot of the hill near the 3 Oaks crossways. Then I rushed to the telephone instrument and spoke to the police sergeant on duty in Newport Pagnell, asking him to stop any car approaching from my house, informing him what had occurred. But half an hour later, he rang up to tell me that no car had entered the town from any direction. Therefore, it was apparent that in preference to passing through Newport Pagnell, it had been turned into one of the side roads and taken a cross-country route to some unknown destination. I said nothing, but to me it was quite apparent that the object of the attempt upon my safe was the mysterious bronze cylinder, which I held in trust from Melville Arnold. When alone in the room, I opened the safe with my key, and to my satisfaction saw the battered ancient object still reposing there, together with the letters and the translation of the hieroglyphics. Once again I took out the heavy cylinder, the greatest treasure of the strange old fellow who had deliberately destroyed a fortune, and held it in my hand filled with wonder and bewilderment. What could it contain that would astonish the world? Surely nothing nowadays astonishes this matter-of-fact world of ours. We have become used to the demonstrations of wonders, from the use of steam to the development of aviation, the telephonic discovery, and the application of wireless telegraphy. How I longed to call on a blacksmith, cut through the metal, and ascertain what was therein contained. But I did not dare. I held the thing in trust for some unknown person who, on Thursday, the 3rd day of November, would come to me and demand its possession. All that I had been told of the misfortunes which had fallen upon its possessor, and the mysterious fate which would overtake any who attempted to tamper with it, flashed through my brain. Indeed, in such train did my thoughts run that I began to wonder if possession of the thing had any connection with the appearance of that mysterious hand. Presently, however, I put the cylinder back into its place and relocked the safe, for the police from Newport Pagnell had arrived, and I bade them enter. They made a minute examination of the room and took possession of the objects left behind by the intruders, but upon them no fingerprints could be found. My visitors were evidently expert thieves, for they had worn gloves, and they had, no doubt, been in the house a full hour before they had tried the safe handle and unconsciously set off the alarm. Had they applied the powerful jet to the steel door and fused a hole through it, then they might have accomplished their object without disarranging the alarm at all. Next day, however, packing the cylinder, the old newspaper, and the letters in the bag, I took them up to London, where I placed them in a box in the Safe Deposit Company's vaults in Chancery Lane. Afterwards, I lunched at my club and returned again to Upton in the same evening. Suddenly, it occurred to me while I sat alone eating my dinner that night that if Harvey Shaw and Mrs. Olive were actually friends, then the latter would probably be aware of his whereabouts. The suggestion aroused me to activity, and it being a fine bright evening with the prospect of full moon later, I got out my thick motor coat, packed a small bag, and after tuning up the car, set out on the long run towards Bath. My way lay through Finney Stratford and Bicester, through Oxford, and down to Newbury. When I passed the Jubilee clock in the latter town, it was 2:15, while in the broad street of Marlborough, 18 miles farther on, I stopped to examine the near tire. It had, as I expected, a puncture. Therefore I leisurely put on my stepney, and with 30-odd miles before me drove out upon the old highway over the hill through Caen, and up Black Dog Hill to Chippenham, where in the marketplace stood a constable, with whom I exchanged greetings. There is a certain weird charm in motoring at night, when every town and village is dark and in slumber. Yet it is surprising how many people are out at an early hour. Even ere the first flush of dawn, one finds sturdy men going to work with their day's food in the bag upon their backs, and teams of horses being driven to the fields. It was nearly 5:30 when I sped down the steep incline of Box Hill, and, slipping through Box Village and Bath Easton, found myself winding round that leafy road with the city of Bath lying picturesquely below. At 6 I was once again at the York House Hotel, and after a wash went for an early morning stroll in the town. Then, after breakfast, I took my hat and stick and strolled out for nearly 3 miles along the road to the inn at Kelston, where I called for a glass of ale and sat down to chat with the white-bearded landlord, who at once recognized me as having been a customer on a previous occasion. For a long time, as I sat in the cozy little parlor, the table of which was dark and polished with the ale of generations spilt upon it, we chatted about the weather, the prospects of harvest, and the latest iniquity of taxation, until in a careless way I remarked, "I suppose in summer you have lots of visitors down from London the people who have big houses about here entertain a lot?" "Oh, I don't know," replied the old fellow, sipping his glass which he was taking with me. "The Joyces do have a lot o' visitors, and so do the Strongs, but Mrs. Olive's been away, and has only just come back. And Mr. King, he's been away too. Ridgehill's been shut up, and half the servants away on holiday. And they're back now. Yes, Mrs. Olive's been abroad, so the butler told me yesterday. But there," and his lips closed suddenly, as though he had something to say, but feared to utter it. "Rather a funny lot, so I've heard," I remarked. "Yes, nobody can quite make 'em out, to tell the truth. Only the night before last, or rather about 4:45 in the morning, Mrs. Olive, her brother, and another gentleman went by air in a car on their way home. They've been out all night, so the chauffeur told me yesterday. Mr. King drove the car. Out all night," I echoed in sudden wonder. "Yes, and they've been a long way, judging from the appearance of the car. I happened to get up to see the time, and looked out on my window just as they came past. It isn't the first time either that they've been out all night. The village knows it, and everyone is asking where they go to, and what takes them out of their beds like that." "Who was the gentleman with them?" I inquired eagerly. I couldn't see him very well. He was in a big frieze coat, and wore a black and white check cap. I didn't catch his face, but by his clothes, he was a stranger to me. You've only seen him on that occasion. Only that once, sir. The chauffeur told me, however, that he isn't staying at Ridge Hill and that nobody saw him. So he must have got out after passing through the village. Perhaps it was somebody they were given a lift to. I've seen Mrs. Olive take notice of some queer people sometimes. And funnily enough, only yesterday a gentleman came in here and was making a lot of inquiries after her. He was a foreigner, a Frenchman, I think. A Frenchman, I cried. What was he like? Oh, like most Frenchmen. He had finikin ways, was middle-aged, with a brown beard which he seemed always stroking. He had lunch here and stayed all the afternoon smoking cigarettes and looking through this window as though he hoped to see her pass. He was so inquisitive that I was glad when Edie gone. I suppose, the man added, he's somebody she's met abroad, eh? But I knew the truth. His inquisitive visitor was Victor Tramu. Chapter 24. A Woman's Word. A hot, dusty walk took me beside the telegraph wires back to Bath, and the remainder of the day I spent in idleness in the hotel. If the great French detective were in the vicinity, then I had no desire to be seen by him. Therefore I deemed it best to lie quite low until nightfall. At 4 o'clock, after great delay, I got on to Tucker on the telephone and inquired if there had been any letters or messages for me. The police have been here again, and there's a telephone message, sir, replied the old man's voice. It came about 11 o'clock from a lady, sir. I took it down. Read it over, I said. Then, listening intently, I heard the old man's voice say, the message, sir, is, please ask Mr. Kimball to ring up, if possible, 802 Bournemouth, the Royal Bath Hotel, at 6 o'clock this evening, for Miss Seymour. My heart gave a bound of delight. Nothing else, Tucker? No, sir. That's all the lady said. She seemed very anxious indeed to speak to you. All right, Tucker. I'll be back in a day or two. By the way, send on my letters to the Grand Hotel, Bournemouth. Very well, sir. And tell the police not to worry any further over the burglary. Tell them I will see the inspector in Newport Pagnell on my return. All right, sir. And then I hung up the receiver and rang off. Asked if it was at Bournemouth. My first impulse was to start at once to see her, but recollecting the reason I had come there to Bath, I managed to curb my impatience, eat my dinner in the quiet, old-fashioned coffee room, and afterwards wait until darkness fell. I had no fixed plans, except to approach the manor house unobserved. I longed to call boldly upon the woman whom I knew to be an adventuress, but I could not see what benefit would accrue from it. If any conspiracy were in progress, she would, of course, deny all knowledge of Shaw's whereabouts. Therefore I bought some cigars which I placed in my case, and when the autumn twilight had deepened into night, I put on my motor cap, and taking my stick, set out again to cover the 3 miles or so which lay between the hotel and the residence of the wealthy widow. I did not hurry, and as I approached the village and passed the inn with the red blinds, I kept a wary eye, fearing lest Tramu might be in the vicinity. That it was he who had been making inquiry of the landlord, there was no doubt. In what manner the French police had gained knowledge of the woman Olive's address I knew not, and why he was in England watching her was equally a mystery. One fact was evident, namely, that the parish sheriff had some serious charge against her, and further, that she must be all unconscious of the presence of the renowned police agent. Should I discover any hint or gain anything by giving her warning? I asked myself, no, she was far too clever for that. If, as I had suspected, she had had any hand in poor Guy's death, then it was only right that the inquiries and action of the police should not be interfered with. Again, was it not a highly suspicious circumstance that, with her husband, the man-king, who posed as her brother, together with a stranger, she had returned home at that early hour in a car, a few hours after a car had left the Kingswood, half a mile from my own house? I passed through the village unobserved and out again up the steep hill until I came to that low wall behind which lay the part surrounding Ridge Hill Manor, that same wall from which a few weeks before I had obtained my first sight of the house of the adventuress. Fortunately, the night had become cloudy, threatening rain, and the moon was hidden. So, mounting the wall, I entered the park and walked across towards the broad lawn in front of the manor. A dry ditch separated the lawn from the park to prevent cattle from approaching, and this I presently negotiated, at last standing upon the lawn itself. Nearby, I saw a weeping ash, and beneath its bell-like branches I paused and there waited. From where I stood, I could see into the big lighted drawing room, the blinds of which were up, but there was no one within, though the French windows stood open. I could hear voices of the servants, most probably, and the clatter of dishes being washed after dinner. But the night was very still. Not a leaf stirred in the dark belt of firs which lay on my left, and which presently afforded me better shelter, allowing me to approach nearer the house. The night mists were rising, and the air had become chilly. Certainly this woman of many adventures, even though she were a convicted criminal, managed to live amid delightful surroundings. As the evening wore on, I caught a glimpse of her crossing the room in a black low-cut dinner dress edged with silver, a truly handsome gown. She swept up to the piano, and next moment there fell upon my ear the music of one of the latest waltzes of musical comedy. Then her husband, cigar in hand and in well-cut evening dress, came to the French window, looked out upon the night, and retired again. But after that I saw nothing until an hour later, when the butler closed the window carefully and bolted it, and then one by one the lights in the lower portion of the fine mansion disappeared, and those upstairs were lit. 2 windows, evidently the double windows of a corner room opposite me, were lit brilliantly behind a green holland blind, but half an hour later they also were extinguished. I glanced at my watch. It was then 11:30, and the house was in total darkness. Yet I still waited, wondering vaguely if Tramu were still in the vicinity. I found an old tree stump, and sitting upon it, waited in watchful patience, wondering if the agent of French police would make his appearance. Suddenly, however, a bright stream of light, evidently from an electric torch, shot from one of the upstairs windows and continued for some seconds. Then it was shut off again, only to be renewed about a minute later. It was a signal, and could be seen from the high road. My curiosity was now thoroughly aroused, and I moved cautiously across the lawn to such a position that I could see anyone leaving or approaching the house by the drive. Again I waited for fully 20 minutes, when a slight movement caused me to turn, and I saw the figure of a woman hurrying along the side of the lawn in the shadow of the belt of firs. At first I was puzzled as to who it might be, but presently, when she was compelled to pass out of the shadow into the gray light cast by the clouded moon, I saw that it was the woman who called herself Olive. She wore a dark dress with a dark shawl thrown over her head. In her eager hurry, she had not noticed my presence as I stood there in the shadow. Therefore, when she had passed out into the misty park with its dark clump of trees, I quickly followed with noiseless tread over the dewy grass. She had evidently signaled to somebody, unknown to her husband. Straight across the wide grasslands, I followed until she gained a spot where a stile gave entrance to a dark wood on the opposite side of the park. There she halted, and I was only just in time to draw back in the shadow and hide myself. I watched, and a few minutes later I was startled at hearing that peculiar whistle of Shaw's, and next moment he emerged from the wood and joined her. "Well, what's the fear?" I heard him ask her quickly. "I had your wire this morning, and got a bath by the last train. Couldn't you have written?" "No, it was highly dangerous," was her low response, and then she uttered some quick explanation which I could not catch. Was it possible that she had learnt of Tramu's visit, for I distinctly heard him cry, "You fool, why did you bring me here? Why weren't you more wary?" But in her reply, she turned her back upon me, so that I could not distinguish her words. They stood close together in the darkness, conversing in low tones, as though in earnest consultation, while I, holding my breath, strove in vain to catch their words. The only other sound was the mournful hooting of an owl in the trees above, for the dead stillness of the night was now upon everything. "Exactly," I heard the woman say. "My own opinion is that he suspects. Therefore you must act quickly, as before." I am hesitating," the man's voice replied. "I can't bring myself to do it. I really can't." "Bosh! Then leave it to me," she urged in a hard, rasping voice. "You're becoming timid, chicken-hearted. It isn't like you, surely." "I'm not timid," he protested. Only I foresee danger, great danger. So do I, if you don't act promptly. Get her away from Bournemouth. Go anywhere else you like. They were speaking of Asta. I strained my ears, but her further words were inaudible. In a moment, however, I became conscious of a slight stealthy movement in the bushes near where I was standing, and turned my head quickly. The next second, I realized that only a few yards distant from me, the dark figure of a man had come up through the undergrowth, but so carefully that he had made no noise. He stood 10 yards away, peering out at the pair, but all unconscious of my presence there. He was watching intently, and by his silhouette in the darkness, I recognized the bearded face of none other than the great agent of the Paris Charite, Victor Tramu. Chapter 25. In the night. Fearing lest as quick I should detect my presence, I stood there motionless as a statue. The pair, in earnest conversation, suddenly strolled away over the fallen leaves at the edge of the wood, whereupon Tramu emerged silently from his hiding place and crept after them, I being compelled to remain where I was. So the French police had traced Shaw to his place of concealment. I longed to give him warning, but was unable. What should I do? How should I act? Asta was at the Bath Hotel at Bournemouth. At least I could ring her up on the telephone and tell her what I had seen. So the watcher and the watched having disappeared, I hurried across the park until at length I gained the main road and went on at a brisk pace till I was back again at my hotel. It took me a full hour to get on to Bournemouth, and after long delay, I at last heard her sweet, well-remembered voice at the instrument. I expressed regret at awakening her, but told her that I was leaving by motor in half an hour to meet her. "Where is your father?" I inquired. "I don't exactly know. He left me at Burford Bridge Hotel at Box Hill last Monday, and I came here to await him. 5 days have gone, and I've had no letter." "Then he hasn't been to Bournemouth?" "No." "Well," I said, "do not go out of the hotel until I arrive, will you?" "Not if you wish me to remain in," was her reply, and then, promising I would be with her at the earliest moment, as I wished to see her on a matter of gravest importance, I rang off. Half an hour afterwards I paid my bill, even though it were the middle of the night, and going out to the garage, started my engine, and with my bag in the back of the car sped away in the drizzling rain eastward out of Bath. I chose the road through Norton Street Phillip, Warminster, and Wilton to Salisbury, where I had an early breakfast at the Old White Hart, and then, striking south, I went by Downton Wicket Fording Bridge, through Ringwood and Christchurch, past the grey old Abbey Church, and on through suburban Boscombe until, just after 9 o'clock, I pulled up before the big entrance to the Bath Hotel in Bournemouth. Into the pretty palm court where I waited, Asta, my lost love, came at last with outstretched hand, smiling me a welcome greeting. She looked dainty in blue serge skirt and muslin blouse, and there being no one else in the place at that early hour, the idlers not yet having arrived to read the papers and novels, we sat together in a corner to chat. By the pallor of her soft, delicate countenance, I saw that she was nervous and troubled, though she showed a brave front and affected a gay light-heartedness that was only feigned. "Tell me, Miss Seymour," I said presently, bending to her very seriously, "what happened to you on that night in Ike's?" "Happened," she echoed, her dark eyes opening widely. It was indeed a narrow escape. Had Dad not provided himself with a key to the back stairs in readiness for emergencies, we should have both been arrested, just as you were." "Yes," I smiled, "but I was released." "What happened to you?" "We caught the Paris Express, only just as it was leaving, but Dad, fearing that our flight had been telephoned to Paris, decided to get out at La Roche, where we stopped to change engines, and from there we took train by Troyes and Nancy to Strasbourg. Then, once in Germany, we could, of course, escape Trauma's attentions," and she smiled. "And from Germany?" "We remained a week in Berlin. Thence we went to Copenhagen by way of Kiel and Korser, and 10 days ago crossed from Hamburg to Harwich. Home again." "Your father is certainly extremely clever in evading the police," I said, with a laugh. "Our only fear was for you," she said, "whether they would learn anything by watching you. They learnt nothing, even though they submitted me to a very close examination. But," I added, "how did you know Trauma was in Ike's?" "I was ascending in the lift that evening, and as we passed the first floor, I saw him talking with the hotel manager. Dad had once pointed him out to me at Monte Carlo. So I suspected the reason of his visit there, and scribbled you a line of warning before we took our bags and slipped away. But for what reason is he so anxious to secure your arrest? I asked, looking straight into her face. Cannot you tell me the truth, Miss Seymour? Remember, I am your friend, I added earnestly. Please do not ask me, she urged. I cannot betray the man who has been father to me all these years, she added in a low, pained voice. But are you quite certain that he is as devoted to you as he professes? I asked very gravely. Absolutely. Am I not the only real friend he has? I recollected that letter written by the man who had loved her and the allegations he had made. Do you know, I said, the other night I had burglars at my home. They tried to break open the safe which contains that mysterious cylinder given into my charge by Mr. Melville Arnold. The cylinder, she gasped, instantly turning pale as death. That hateful cylinder, which brings upon its possessor misfortune and disaster. Why don't you get rid of it, Mr. Kemble? I have. It is now in the Safe Deposit Company's vaults in Chancery Lane. She held her breath, her gaze fixed upon me. Then involuntarily, she laid her slim white hand upon my coat sleeve and said, I always fear for your safety, Mr. Kemble, while that thing is in your possession. Give it away. Destroy it. Anything. Only get rid of it. But I cannot until the 3rd of November. I accept it as sacred trust, remember, given by a dying man, I said. Yes, but what? I asked. Then in a low voice, as I bent towards her, I added, Miss Seymour, I have deep suspicion that your father, a friend of Arnold's, knows what the cylinder contains and is extremely eager to get possession of it. Is not that so? She was silent. Her lips moved nervously. Her indecision to speak told me the truth. We were friends, therefore she could not deliberately lie to me. A faint smile overspread her pale, refined features. That was all, but it told its own tale. Well, I said, the burglars, whoever they were experts, and only the electric alarm prevented the theft. What the ancient cylinder really contains, I cannot imagine. Indeed, I am filled with anxiety and impatience for the dawn of November the 3rd, when, without doubt, I shall learn the truth. Yes, no doubt, she said in a slow, tremulous tone, and the truth will surely be a stranger one than you have ever dreamed. Our tete-a-tete was suddenly interrupted by a woman entering the lounge. Therefore, as Asta had her hat and coat with her, I suggested that we should walk down to the beach, an idea which she readily adopted. Then, when there was no one to overhear, I told her of my adventure in the night, of Tramu's inquiries in the neighborhood of Ridge Hill Manor, and of his surveillance of the movements of Mrs. Olive and her father. Tramu, she gasped, her face white as death. Then he has found poor Dad. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I had no wish to alarm you unduly, Miss Seymour, I said very quietly. But Dad may be arrested, she cried. How fatal to associate again with that accursed woman. She is certainly no friend of yours, but she makes great pretense of friendship. I have often been her guest. For the last time, I trust. Yes, but what can we do? How can I warn Dad? She asked in deep anxiety. Miss Seymour, I said, after a brief silence. I fear that you think a little too much of your foster father, and too little of your own self. Why? She asked quickly, with some resentment. Again I hesitated. We had wandered upon the pier, but it was as yet early, and few people, save the early morning exercise men, were about. Let us sit here a moment, I suggested at last. It is pleasant in the sunshine. I have something to show you. Without a word, she seated herself where I suggested, on a seat near the empty bandstand, and then I drew from my pocket the letter which Guy Nicholson had written to me on the night of his tragic death, and handed it to her. I watched her sweet face, so pale and anxious. In an instant she recognized the writing of the hand now dead, and read it through eagerly from end to end. I explained how it had come so tardily into my possession, whereupon she said, It is true, he disliked Dad for some inexplicable reason. Apparently, he had become aware of some extraordinary truth. It was that truth which he had intended to explain to me. But, poor fellow, he was prevented from doing so by his sudden death. Sight of that letter had recalled to her visions of the man whom she had loved so fondly, and next instant I hated myself for having acted injudiciously in showing her the curious missive. Ah, how deeply, how devotedly I loved her, and yet I dared not utter one single word of affection. That calm, sweet countenance, with those big, wonderful eyes, was ever before me, sleeping or waking, and yet I knew not from hour to hour that she might not be arrested and placed in a criminal dock as accomplice of that arch-adventurer Shaw, that man who led such a strange dual existence of respectability and undesirability. I cannot understand what he discovered regarding the apparition of the hand, she exclaimed at last, still gazing upon the letter in a half-dreamy kind of way. It seems as though, by some fact accidentally discovered, he arrived at the solution of the mystery, I said. It was to explain this to me that he intended to come over to Upton End, but was, alas, prevented. But why didn't he tell me? She queried. It surely concerned myself, for I had seen it. Not in our own house, remember, but in the house of a friend at Scarborough. And I saw it in an obscure French inn, I said, and previously I had been warned against it. Yes, I agree, Mr. Kemble. It is a complete mystery. Ah, how unfortunate that poor guy never lived to tell you his theory concerning the strange affair. But, she added, our present action must concern dear old Dad. What do you suggest we should do? How can we give him warning? I can suggest nothing, was my reply. Trauma was watching them both. Probably he is fully aware of some ingenious conspiracy in progress. I foresaw danger in his association with her, the girl declared, pale and anxious in her despair. But why has not your father returned to Lidford? Surely while his whereabouts could be preserved from trauma, he will be safer there than anywhere. You might be watched, and if you visited us, you might be followed. Tramu is, as you know, one of the most famous detectives in Europe, and he has, in your father, one who is a past master in the art of evasion. But, I added, tell me frankly, Miss Seymour, do you anticipate that he is anxious to possess himself of the bronze cylinder? She hesitated again. Well, yes. As you ask me for a plain reply, I tell you that I believe his intention is to gain possession of it. Why? Because of the great secret therein contained. And of what nature is this remarkable secret? I demanded eagerly, much puzzled by her response. How can we tell? It is a secret from all, save to the person who shall dare break it open and examine it. And dare you break it open, Miss Seymour? I asked. No, 1,000 times no, she cried, alarmed at the very suggestion. I would rather see it taken up and cast deep into the sea. Why don't you do that, Mr. Kemble? Take it out in a boat and sink it deep in the waters, where no man, not even diverse, could ever recover it. Sink it deeply, she urged, so that all fears may be dispelled, and peace and love may reign. But I shook my head, expressing regret at my utter inability to accede to her desire. And then very slowly we retraced our steps back to the hotel, where an unexpected surprise was, we found, awaiting us. Chapter 26 contains an ominous message. As we re-entered the pretty winter garden, the hall porter gave Asta a telegram, which she tore open hastily and read, afterwards handing it to me in silence. To my surprise, I found it to be from Shaw, informing her that he was on his way to Lidford and asking her to return home that day. The message had been handed in at Bath railway station. Therefore, it appeared that he was already on his way. Is there not danger, distinct danger, in this, Mr. Kemble? She queried, in great anxiety. If Trauma were watching last night, then he will be followed home. I don't see how we can prevent him from going to Lidford now, I said. We have no address where a telegram would reach him. Truly the situation was a critical one. Harvey Shaw, all unconscious of being watched, was actually returning to his highly respectable home. Oh, if I could only warn him. Asta cried, wringing her hands. Yet, personally, I was not thinking of the man's peril so much as hers. If she went to Lidford, would not she also fall into the dragnet of the police? Yet what was the mysterious charge against her? The charge which the French police had refused to reveal to me. While she changed her dress and packed her small trunk, I had a look around my engine. And an hour later, with her sitting beside me, we were already buzzing along the Salisbury Road, returning by that level way I had followed earlier that morning. From Salisbury, we traveled the whole day by way of Andover, Newbury, and Oxford, the same road that I had traversed in the night on my way to Bath. It was delightful to have her as companion through those sunny hours on the road, and she looked inexpressibly dainty in her close-fitting little bonnet, fur coat, and gauntlet gloves. An enthusiastic motorist, she often drove her father's car, which I now understood they had been compelled to abandon in the garage at Ike's. The police had taken possession of it, but as both the French and English numbers it bore were false ones, no clue to the address of its owner would be obtained. Yet though she charmed me by her voice, though her sweet beauty filled my whole being and intoxicated my senses, nevertheless, I somehow experienced a strange presage of evil. Had Harvey Shaw once again exercised those precautions against disaster and managed to elude the vigilance of the great French police agent? That was the main question in my mind as I drove the car hard, for Asta seemed all eagerness to get home. If Shaw had been unsuspicious, what more natural than that he should be followed by Tramu to that hiding place where he assumed the role of country gentleman? The autumn afternoon wore on, and I could not help noticing that the nearer we approached her home, the paler and more anxious became the girl at my side. And I love her, yes. I love her more than my pen has power to describe. She possessed me body and soul. She was all in all to me. That she was reflecting upon the letter penned by Guy almost immediately before his death, I knew by her several references to it. I wonder what is the solution of that shadowy hand which we both have seen, Mr. Kemble? She exclaimed suddenly, after sitting in silence for some time, her eyes fixed upon the muddy road that lay before us. You mean the solution at which Nicholson apparently arrived? I said, yes. How can we tell? He evidently discovered something of extreme importance which he wished to communicate to me. I wonder why he makes those extraordinary statements about Dad and the locked cupboard in his room. I don't know. Have you ever seen inside that cupboard? I asked quickly, my eyes still upon the road. Never. But poor Guy seems to have regarded it as a kind of Bluebeard's cupboard, doesn't he? He seems to have entertained a curious suspicion concerning your father, I admitted. Of course, he did not know half that I know. Of course not, she sighed. He simply believed, as others do, that he is a country gentleman. And he would have been if what? If it had not been for that horrible woman, she added in a low, hard voice. Ah, Mr. Kemble, if only you could know the truth, if only I dare tell you. But I can't. I can't betray the man who has been so good and kind to me all my life. But could I not, if I knew the actual truth, be of service to him? I suggested, could I not be of service to him for your sake? I added, in a low, earnest tone, my eyes fixed upon her pale, troubled countenance. She looked at me in sharp, startled surprise. Her cheeks flushed slightly. Then, lowering her eyes, she turned her glance away, straight before her again, and in pretense that she had not understood my meaning, replied simply, if the heavy hand of disaster falls upon him, then I fear it must fall upon me also. How sweet she looked! How serious and pensive her beautiful countenance! I must act as your friend and use my best endeavors to ward it off, I said. Did you not do so in Ike's, Mr. Kemble? We have to thank you for everything. They expected to learn a good deal through you, and while you engaged their attention, we were enabled to make a hurried exit. It is indeed fortunate that I recognized Victor Tramu. Then I suppose you have had previous narrow escapes? One or two, she replied, smiling. But Dad is always so very wary. He is generally forewarned. By whom? By the man who watches him always, a man named Surridge, who never allows his identity to be known, but who acts as our watchdog to give us warning of any unwelcome watcher. But he failed at Ike's, because Dad foolishly sent him upon an errand to somebody in Paris. He is a friend of your father's, I suppose. Yes, a great friend. He was once in the London Detective Police, but on his retirement, he found his present post a very lucrative one. The personal guardian of one for whom the police are ever in search. You saw him on a cycle in the afternoon. I overtook you in the car. The first time we met?" And she smiled as she spoke. "His vigilance is never relaxed," she added, "and his true métier never suspected. No doubt he is near my father now, on his journey back to Lidford." "Then he would not allow him to go if he were still being watched by Tramo?" "Certainly not. We can, I think, after all, make our minds quite easy upon that score," she replied. And as I sat at the steering wheel, I found myself wondering whether any other man had loved in circumstances so curious and so unusual. At the hotel in Bournemouth, we had carefully concealed our destination, telling the hall porter we were going to London, lest any inquiry be made after our departure. We had tea at the Randolph at Oxford, and it was nearly 7:30 before we drew up before the grey stone front of Lidford Hall, where the butler threw open the door. The sound of the car brought Shaw out in surprise, and as soon as we had washed, we all three sat down to dinner in the fine old dining room. About Shaw there was no trace of the least anxiety. Yet when the man had gone and I told him in a whisper of what I had seen when watching in the park at Ridgewell, he started, and his face underwent a change. "I was a fool to have gone there," he said, "but it was unfortunately of necessity. Surridge was in Bath, but did not know that I went out to Ridgehill. Trauma may have had you watched, Dad." "No fear of that, child," he laughed. "Surridge arranged for a hired car for me today from Bath to Westbury, where I took train to Newbury, and the 16 met me there and brought me here. So for Tramu to follow is out of the question. I have not seen Surridge, but merely carried out his arrangements. He may, of course, have had a motive in them." "No doubt he had, Dad." The butler at that moment returned with the next course. Therefore, our intimate conversation was abruptly interrupted. As I sat at that table, lavishly spread and adorned with a wealth of flowers and a profusion of splendid old Georgian silver, my eyes wandered to the sweet-faced girl who, in a low-cut gown of palest Odinil chiffon, with velvet in her hair to match, held me so entirely and utterly entranced. Later that evening, while I had a cigar alone with Shaw, who lay back lazily in his chair, I detected his annoyance that I should have watched him meet the woman Olive. And yet how cleverly he concealed his anger, for he was, on the contrary, apologetic for the abrupt ending of our motor tour, and profuse in his thanks to me for my silence when interrogated by the police at Ike's. Was this actually the man who had made the attempt to break open my safe and secure the bronze cylinder of Melville Arnold? No, I cannot believe it. He was an adventurer, without a doubt, but men of his stamp are invariably loyal to those who show them friendship. What, I wondered, had caused Guy Nicholson to doubt his affection for Asta? I certainly could detect nothing to cause me to arrive at such conclusion. The girl entered the room to obtain a book, whereupon, removing his cigar from his mouth, he said, in a low voice, "Come and sit here, dear. I haven't been with you lately. I fear you must have found Bournemouth dreadfully dull." "Well, I did rather. Mr. Kimball's unexpected arrival was most welcome, I assure you," she declared, sinking into a chair and placing both hands behind her beautiful head as she leaned back upon the yellow silk cushion. "I confess I had no suspicions that Mr. Kimball was in Bath," declared her father with a smile. Then turning to me, he added, "I fear to communicate with you, lest Trauma might be watching your correspondence. He is one of the few really intelligent police officials that France possesses. He is evidently extremely anxious to make your acquaintance." I laughed. "I believe so, and I am equally anxious to avoid him. While I remain here, however, I am quite unsuspected and safe. It is really surprising," he added, "what an air of respectability a little profuse charity gives to one in a country district. Become a churchwarden, get appointed a justice of the peace, sit upon the board of guardians, give a few teas and school treats, and subscribe to the church funds. And though you may be an entire outsider, you can do no wrong in the eyes of the country folk. I know it from experience." "You're a little too reckless sometimes, Dad," exclaimed the girl, shaking her head. "Remember that when you've not taken Surridge's advice, you've run into danger." But the man with the small, shrewd eyes smiled at the girl's words of wisdom. Again and again there recurred to me those strange expressions in the letter of poor Guy. If he only had lived. And yet if he were still alive, my love for the girl before me must have been a hopeless one. Only on those last weeks had she abandoned her deep, black, that she often sat for hours plunged in bitter memories I knew full well. Would she ever sufficiently forget to allow me to take his place in her young heart? Knowing her nature, her honest, true, open-hearted disposition, I sometimes experienced a strange heart-sinking that, after all, she could never reciprocate my love. Yet now, as the weeks had gone on, my affection had become stronger and stronger, until I was seized by a passion akin to madness. I love her with my soul, as truly and as well as ever man has loved a woman through all ages. Yet, for what reason I cannot even now determine, I felt a strange foreboding that evil was pursuing her. I experienced exactly the same feeling that Guy Nicholson had felt when he penned that letter to me, the delivery of which was, alas, so long delayed. Presently, when Asta had risen again and left the room, Shaw turned to me and said, "Poor girl, Guy's death was a great blow to her, but she is gradually getting over it. Don't you think so? I should never have risked going to the continent had it not been for her sake, in order to give her a change. But in these last few weeks, we've had sufficient change, in all conscience. She's always so cool and level-headed that I feel lost without her." Kemble. His words were surely not those of an enemy. No, more than ever was I convinced of his devotion to the girl who, as a tiny child, he had adopted as his own daughter. Mention of Nicholson, however, afforded me opportunity to tell him how tardily I had received a letter from the dead man. It was written only an hour before he died, I added. Written, I suppose, after his guest had left? Asked Shaw, his face a little hard and changed, I thought. He mentioned me. What did he say? What did he tell you? Nothing, I replied, sorry that I had spoken so injudiciously. Poor guy didn't like me, I fear, declared my host quietly. He didn't know what you know, and hence he viewed me with suspicion. I couldn't very well tell him the truth, or he would have cast poor little Asta aside. I quite understand, I said. Well, what did he say against me? He asked, looking at me strangely with those small, mysterious eyes of his. Nothing whatever. You are deceiving me. I know what he has told you. He has revealed to you something. He has revealed nothing, I declared. Why should he? But the man lying back in his chair drew at his cigar hard and contemplatively, a strange smile overspreading his broad features. I saw that he was unconvinced, and that upon his countenance was a curious dark expression such as I had never before seen. Yet it was only for an instant, for next moment he was smiling and invited me, as I was, to remain there the night. I, however, declined, for I expected some important business letters at home, and was compelled, therefore, to return to Upton End, towards which destination I set forth about 10 o'clock. I had traveled about 10 miles, when 3 miles the other side of Corby village, a double calamity befell me. Not only did one of my back tires burst, but something went wrong with my magneto. Hence, in the darkness, and with rain beginning to fall, I was brought to a complete standstill. Midnight passed. I was several miles from anywhere, and magnetos are tricky things. I could not get the car to budge, even though I put on my Stepney wheel. I must, I suppose, have been pottering about for fully 3 hours, and not a soul had passed me in either direction. The distant chimes of a church somewhere had struck 2, and when just about to give up the attempt to readjust the magneto, I suddenly heard the sound of a galloping horse approaching in the darkness. As it came up, I saw it was ridden by a youth, and I was just about to hail him and ask him to fetch assistance, when, with the perversity of such instruments, the magneto started again quite merrily. Therefore I once again mounted at the wheel, and flashing past the lonely horseman, pushed on through the rain over the many weary miles till I at last reached my own home. Next morning, while seated alone at breakfast, I heard a sound, and, to my great surprise, recognized the same young horseman, muddy and wearied, coming up the drive. With curiosity, I went forth to meet him, when he handed me a note, saying, Miss Seymour, of Lidford, asked me to bring this at once, sir. It is very important. I've been riding all night. Yes, I cried. Why? I remember I passed you in my car. I tore open the letter, and found in it some scribbled words in pencil, which read, I am in deadly peril. If you are my friend, come here at once, and save me. Asta, Chapter 27. In the Balance. How did you get this? I asked the youth. Who are you? I'm John May, sir, was his answer. I work in the gardens at Lidford, and last night, soon after 11, as I was coming home from Rockingham, I met Miss Astor out in the drive. She was like a mad thing. She had the letter and wanted it delivered at once. So I went to the stables and, saying nothing, came away. Then she had written this note and gone out in the hope of finding someone to deliver it. I exclaimed, glancing at his horse and noticing that it was absolutely done up after an all-night ride. I didn't know it was you, sir, that passed me in a motor car, the young gardener went on. No, I said, rereading the mysterious summons for help. But you and your horse must remain here and rest. I shall return to Lidford in the car. Full of anxiety, I put on my mackintosh and cap, for it was raining steadily, and within a quarter of an hour of receiving the note, I was already on my way along the autumn-tinted roads. The morning was that of the 1st of November. Regardless of speed limits or of police traps, I tore along until, just before 11, I again pulled up at the ancient stone porch of the hall. A maidservant opened the door, and I eagerly inquired for Miss Seymour. She's very ill, sir, was the girl's reply. Mr. Shaw's been called on the bench this morning, but he'll be back in an hour. Dr. Redwood is here, sir. Redwood? Then what's the matter? I gasped. I hardly know, sir. But here's Mrs. Howard, and looking along the wide hall, I saw the grave-faced woman in black standing out of the light. Oh, Mrs. Howard? I cried, walking up to her. What's happened to Miss Asta? Tell me, is she ill? Very, I'm afraid, sir, replied the housekeeper in a low voice. The doctor is upstairs with her. What happened tonight was most extraordinary and mysterious. Tell me all, I beg of you, I cried quickly. Well, sir, it was like this, said the woman. Last night, about 11, I heard Miss Asta go along the corridor past my room and downstairs into the servants' quarters. She was gone perhaps 20 minutes, and then I heard her repass again to her room and lock the door. I know she did that because I heard it locked distinctly. Miss Asta sleeps at the other end of the corridor to where I sleep, just at the corner as you go round to the front staircase. Well, I suppose after that I must have dropped off to sleep. But just after 2 o'clock we were all awakened by hearing loud, piercing screams of terror. At the first moment of awakening, I was too frightened to move, but realizing that it was Miss Asta, I jumped up instantly, slipped on a dressing gown, and ran along to the door of her room. Several of the other servants, awakened by the cries, were out in the corridor. She had, however, locked her door, and we could not get in. I shouted to her to open it, for she was still shrieking, but she did not do so. At that moment, Mr. Shaw came along in his dressing gown, greatly alarmed, and with his assistance we burst in the door. Then he helped you to do that? Yes, sir, replied the woman. Inside, we found the poor young lady in her nightdress, crouched down on the floor by the ottoman at the foot of the bed. She was still crying hysterically and quivering with fear from head to foot. I bent, and taking her in my arms, asked her what was the matter, for as we had entered, somebody had switched on the electric light. For a moment, she looked at me fixedly with a strange, intense expression, as though she did not recognize me. Then she gasped the words, "Death! Hand! Hand!" That was all. Next moment, she fell back in my arms, and I thought her dead. Mr. Shaw was beside himself with grief. He helped to lift her onto her bed and tried all he could to restore her with brandy and sal volatile, but without avail. In the meanwhile, I had telephoned to Dr. Redwood, who arrived about half an hour later, and he's been here ever since. And how is Miss Asta now? I inquired eagerly, still unconscious. The doctor has, I fear, but little hope of her recovery, sir. She has, he declared, received some great and terrible shock which has affected her heart. The circumstances were strangely parallel with those of Guy Nicholson's mysterious end. No one has formed any conclusion of what caused the shock. No, sir. None of us, not even the doctor, can guess what hand in death could signify more than the usual figure of speech, the woman replied. To me, when she spoke, she seemed to be strangely altered. Her poor face seemed thin, pinched, and utterly bloodless, and when she fell back into my arms, I was convinced that the poor thing had gone. You are quite certain the door of her room was locked? Absolutely. I heard her lock it, as was her habit, and being the first person there on hearing the screams for help, I tried the door and found it still secured on the inside. Mr. Shaw is half demented and would not at first leave the poor young lady's side until compelled to go to the petty sessions. It seems that there is an important case, and no other magistrate is at home to take his place on such short notice. But I'm expecting him back at any moment now. And is Miss Asta still in her room? I asked. I think you said that the door was broken open. Yes, sir. For that reason, we've carried her into the green guest room, which is lower down the corridor, nearer to my own. Thank you, Mrs. Howard, I said. I'll go up and find the doctor. I'm on my way. Then, in quick anxiety, I breathlessly ascended the broad, thickly carpeted oak staircase, and a few moments later was in the room which I knew, by the door, was the apartment in which the weird occurrence had taken place. I recollected only too vividly my own terrible experience, and by those ejaculations which had so puzzled everybody, I knew that she had again witnessed that claw-like hand. The room, cozy, well-furnished, and upholstered in pretty cretonne, was in great disorder. The bed, a brass one, with cretonne hangings over the head to match the furniture, was tumbled with half the clothes upon the floor, while the green satin down quilt had been tossed some distance away. A chair lay overturned, and water and towels were about, showing the attempts at restoration. Upon a little wicker table near the bed stood a shaded electric light, and a novel which my love had evidently been reading on the previous night lay open. Yet though I investigated the room with careful deliberation, fearing every moment lest Shaw should return, I could detect nothing to account for the singular phenomenon. The window stood slightly open, but Mrs. Howard had explained how it had been unlatched by herself. I examined the lock of the door. The key was still on the inside, while the hasp was broken, while the hasp of a small brass safety bolt above had also been forced off. Hence the door must have been both locked and bolted. Certainly, there could have been no intruder in that room. One object caused me curiosity, and my heart beat quickly. Upon the mantel shelf was a little framed snapshot of myself and her father, which she had, one day, taken outside the casino at Ike's. But what had she seen within that room to cause her such a shock? Nay, to produce upon her almost exactly the same symptoms which in the case of Guy Nicholson had terminated fatally. I heard a footstep in the corridor, and emerging from the room, came face to face with the fussy old doctor in his rough tweeds. My unexpected appearance caused him to utter an exclamation of surprise, but when I asked breathlessly for news of his patient, he looked very grave and said, "A weak heart and brain trouble, my dear Mr. Kemble. To tell you frankly, alas, I fear the worst. Come here a moment," I said, taking him by the arm and pulling him into the disordered bedroom. "Now," I added, as I pushed the door to as well as it would go, "tell me truthfully, Dr. Redwood, what do you make of this affair?" "Nothing at present," he replied with a peculiar sniff, a habit of his. "Can't make it out at all. But I don't like the symptoms." Only once she has spoken. In her delirium, she whispered something about a hand. She must have seen something or other, something uncanny, I think. "And yet what can there be here?" he asked, gazing amazedly round the apartment. "Look here, Redwood," I exclaimed firmly. "The facts are very similar to those at Titmarsh. Poor Nicholson saw something, you'll recollect, and he had locked himself in, just as Miss Seymour did." The doctor stroked his ruddy, clean-shaven chin. "I quite admit that in many of the details it is quite a parallel case, but I'm hoping to get the young lady round sufficiently to describe what happened. The servants say that the screams were loud, piercing ones of horror and terror. Shaw himself told me that he had the greatest difficulty in breaking down the door. They found her crouched down in fear, yonder behind the ottoman, and she shrieked out something about a hand. To what could she have referred, do you think? She's quite sane and of perfectly sound mind, or I should attribute the affair to some hallucination." It was more than hallucination, I assured him, recollecting my own experience, yet determined not to assist him towards the elucidation of the mystery. The dead man had evidently made a discovery immediately before his fatal seizure. I recollected that brief, urgent note of Asta's. Had she, 2. Made a similar discovery? Yes. There could be no evasion of the fact. The two cases were in every way identical. For nearly a quarter of an hour, I stood discussing the amazing affair with Redwood. I could see that he was both mystified and suspicious. Therefore, I extracted from him a pledge of secrecy and promised to assist him towards a solution of the extraordinary problem. I made no mention to anybody of Asta's message to me, which I intended should remain a secret. At my earnest appeal, he allowed me to creep on tiptoe into the darkened chamber, wherein still lay unconscious the woman I loved so profoundly, she who was all the world to me. I bent over the poor white face that presented the waxen transparency of death and touched the thin, soft hand that lay outside the coverlet. Then, with eyes filled with tears and half choked by the sob which I was powerless to restrain, I turned away and left the room. Will she recover? I managed to ask the doctor, but he merely raised his thick eyebrows in blank uncertainty. What devil's work had been accomplished within that locked room? What indeed? Against the man Shaw, who had so cleverly misled her into the honest belief that he adored her, there arose within me a deep and angry hatred. Why was he not there, knowing Asta's precarious condition? His excuse of enforced attendance at the petty sessions was no doubt an ingenious one. Little did he dream that before the occurrence Asta had summoned me, and for that reason I was there at her side. So strange had been all the circumstances from that moment when the man of mystery, Melville Arnold, had breathed his last that I had become utterly bewildered. And this amazing occurrence in the night now staggered me. Only one person had solved the mystery of the shadowy hand, and alas, I had not lived to reveal what, no doubt, was a terrible truth. In the corridor, I stood discussing my beloved's condition in low, bated whispers with the fussy country practitioner, a man of the old fox hunting school, for nearly every one rides to hounds in that grass country. He had already telephoned for Dr. Petherbridge in Northampton to come for consultation, and was now expecting him to come over in his car. I have done all I can, Mr. Kemble, he said, but as we don't know the cause, the exact remedy is rather difficult to determine. Every symptom is of brain trouble through fright. Exactly the same symptoms as those you observed in Nicholson, I remarked, whereat he slowly nodded in the affirmative and again stroked his rosy, clean-shaven chin. Well, doctor, I said, I intend to make it my business to investigate the cause of this peculiar phenomenon. And I sat down and wrote an urgent telegram to Cardew, who was, I knew, now stationed at Aldershot. Chapter 28. Another revelation. The dark, anxious hours of that dismal autumn morning went slowly by. Dr. Petherbridge arrived in hot haste from Northampton and had a long and earnest consultation with Redwood. Both men were greatly puzzled. I met them after a long and eager wait, when they emerged in silence from the sick room. We are doing all we can, Mr. Kemble, declared Petherbridge. The young lady is, I regret to say, in a most precarious condition. In fact, in a state of collapse. I begged him to remain, and he did so. For several hours they were constantly at her bedside, while Mrs. Howard, anxious and solicitous for the welfare of her young mistress, expressed surprise that Mr. Shaw did not return. My own suspicion was that he had already fled, yet it proved ungrounded, for at 2:30 he arrived in eager haste, in a hired carriage, his car having broken down. Both doctors came forward and explained that the condition of Miss Asta had in no way improved. She was suffering from some obscure malady which they had diagnosed as affecting both heart and brain. Poor girl, he cried, tears welling in his eyes. Do your best for her. I crave you both, he added. She's all the world to me. Can't we summon a specialist? Sir George Mortimer, in Cavendish Square, might see her, remarked the doctor from Northampton. Let's wire to him at once, urged Shaw, eagerly. I accept your diagnosis entirely, yet I would like to have a specialist's opinion. Both medical men acquiesced, and a telegram was dispatched to the great specialist on brain trouble. As Redwood, seated at the library table, wrote the telegram, his close-set eyes met mine. The glance we exchanged was significant. How did you know of this terrible affair, Kemble? Asked Shaw. abruptly a little time afterwards. "I came over to invite you both to dine next Wednesday," I said, of course concealing the secret message I had received from the woman I had grown to love. In response, he gave a grunt of dissatisfaction and walked down the hall in hasty impatience. Was his impatience an eagerness to hear of the poor girl's end? Surely that could not be, for was he not utterly devoted to her? And yet her seizure and her symptoms were exactly similar to those of poor Guy Nicholson. The whole day I remained there, watching closely Shaw's demeanor and his movements. Once, when he found me alone looking forth from the window of the morning room, he came up beside me and, looking at me with those small, quick eyes of his, said, "This is a terrible blow for me, Kemble. I have been quite frank with you, therefore be frank with me. I've not been blind. I've noticed that you've been in love with the poor child, and, well, to tell the truth, I secretly hoped that one day you would propose marriage to her. My own position is, as you know, one of hourly insecurity, and my keenest wish was to see her happily settled before the crisis." "You guessed the truth," was my reply. "I do love her. I love her more than I can tell." He sighed deeply, a sigh that echoed through the big silent room. "Well," he said, "our grief must be mutual, I fear. Heatherbridge has just told me that they do not believe she can live another hour." Hardly had those words left his mouth when Mrs. Howard ushered in a tall, thin, white-haired man, the eminent specialist, Sir George Mortimer. Without delay, he was taken to the poor girl's room, and then a long period of anxious waiting, while the trio of medical men remained with the door closed. I suppose it must have been about an hour afterwards when, on passing along the carpeted corridor near Shaw's room, next that of Asta, I saw that the door was shut, but as I passed I heard him utter that peculiar whistle, yet so very low that it was only just audible. Twice I heard it, and halting, found myself involuntarily copying him. He was whistling so softly that it could scarcely be overheard beyond the walls of his own room. What was the meaning of that sound? Probably it only escaped his lips when deep in thought. Some men invariably whistle softly or hum tunes while dressing. Yet in any case, it was curious that he should do this while Asta lay dying. All was chaos and disorder in that usually calm, well-ordered household. Just about 7 o'clock Redwood came to me and called me to one of the upstairs rooms, where the great specialist awaited me alone. "I believe that a friend of yours, a Mr. Nicholson, died a little time ago in somewhat similar circumstances to the present case," said Sir George, standing upon the hearthrug with his arms folded. "Now, as far as I can make out, the young lady's illness is due to brain trouble, brought on perhaps by fright. I have seen several similar cases in my experience, and I have treated them. But Miss Seymour, will she live?" I asked in frantic anxiety. That I cannot foretell," he replied calmly, in his soft-spoken voice. "I have administered 2 injections, and I'm glad to tell you that she is infinitely better. Indeed, I expect her very soon to regain consciousness, and we may hope for a turn." Thank God, I cried, with overburdened heart. "She is very dear to me, Sir George," I added with emotion, "and I thank you deeply for your efforts to save her." I quite understand, my dear sir," he said with professional calmness. "Yet from what my 2 colleagues have told me, I can't help thinking that there is, well, a little mystery somewhere." "A little mystery?" I echoed. Sir George, there is a very great mystery, one which I intend at all hazards to investigate, now that Asta has fallen a victim." But as I spoke, the door was unceremoniously pushed open, and Shaw, who had put on a dark blue suit and who looked unusually pale and haggard, entered and inquired for the latest bulletin of the patient. "I'm glad to tell you, Mr. Shaw, that she will probably recover," replied the eminent man. "In an hour we trust to have her conscious again, and then she will, I hope, tell us what happened, what she indicated when, in her fright, she made mention of this mysterious hand. The hand! I recollected those written words of Melville Arnold. She was delirious, I suppose. Poor girl." Shaw said, "But this is real good news that she is getting better. You are quite sure that she will not be taken from us?" "I hope not. I have treated similar cases." Then there is nothing abnormal in this? He cried eagerly. I cannot exactly say that, Mr. Shaw. When the poor young lady recovers, she will be able to tell us what really occurred to cause her mysterious seizure, Sir George replied gravely. Yes, said Shaw. I hope she will be able to clear up the mystery. You think in an hour or so she will be conscious again? I sincerely hope so. And then both men left the room together. Towards 9 o'clock, the crafty-faced butler came to inform me that Captain Cardew wished to see me, and a few seconds later, I grasped hands with Guy Nicholson's friend. The dining room was empty, for though the table had been laid, nobody had thought of dinner. Contrary to expectations, alas, Asta had not recovered consciousness. Only 10 minutes before I had seen Redwood, who admitted that she had taken a slight turn for the worse, and that their anxiety had been considerably increased thereby. I had then sought Shaw, but could not find him. He had gone over to the garage for a moment, Mrs. Howard told me. As soon as I got Cardew alone, however, I told him as briefly as I could what had occurred. Then Miss Seymour's case and Guy's are practically identical, he cried, staring at me. Yes, and I want you to stay here with me and investigate, I said. Then I related how, on the door of her room being burst in, she had, before losing consciousness, made reference to some mysterious hand. That's distinctly curious, Cardew declared. I wonder what she could have meant. That remains to us to discover. Will you assist me? Of course, cried the captain enthusiastically. Only I hope the poor young lady will recover. Surely the doctors ought to be able to diagnose something. They can't say anything definite. It's for you and me to furnish proofs. What do you suspect, Kemble? He asked, looking straight into my face. Wait and see, I replied. At 11 o'clock, if Asta is not then conscious, we will go and investigate the room in which she was lying when seized. We ate some cold meat and drank a glass of claret, for I had touched nothing that day, while he had had a long journey from Aldershot. Then again we sought news of my beloved. Her precarious condition had not altered, and she remained still unconscious. Afterwards I was told by Mrs. Howard that Shaw was in the library, writing. He was greatly upset at the girl's continued unconsciousness, and had expressed a desire not to be disturbed. As I passed the door, I heard him speaking over the telephone to someone. All I heard was the number of the woman Olive. I tried to gather what he said, but was unable. He was purposely speaking in a low voice, so as not to be overheard. When the long old grandfather's clock in the hall had chimed 11, I ascended the wide staircase with Cardew, and with an electric torch which I had several hours ago found in the library, we gained the landing. Redwood brushed past in haste, and in reply to my question gave but little hope of my poor love's recovery. Mortimer is about to make a last effort with another injection, he said, but I fear, Mr. Kemble, that we must now abandon all hope. My heart stood still. His words fell upon me, as though he had struck me a blow. No hope, I managed to gasp. No, none, Mr. Kemble, replied the doctor, and he hurried away to fetch something from the servants' quarters. I made no further remark. Mere words failed me. If Asta were lost to me, then it was my duty to avenge her death. Therefore I drew Cardew into the dark bedroom in which the dying girl had witnessed the hideous apparition of the hand, and then, with difficulty, for one hinge was broken, I closed the door. Afterwards, I switched on the electric light, and we made a minute and careful examination of the apartment. But we discovered nothing. Before entering there, I noticed that the door of Shaw's room adjoining was closed, for he was still downstairs writing. Presently, when we had satisfied ourselves that in the room was nothing suspicious, I pointed out to my friend that if we remained quietly in the darkness, without speaking, no one would suspect us of being there. Now, I added, I'm going to lie on that bed while you sit in yonder armchair in the corner. You take the torch, and at sign of the slightest movement flash on a light at anything you may see. Don't hesitate, for, well, perhaps my life may be in danger, like Guy's. Who knows? I had taken from the corner Asta's small ash walking stick, which she sometimes used when tramping about the country, and with this in my hand, I lay down upon the pillow, fully dressed as I was. Then Cardew, breathless with excitement, switched off the electric light, plunging the room in darkness. Gradually, When our eyes became used to it, we could distinguish a faint gray light from the window, but was not sufficient for me to distinguish my friend, seated as he was in the corner with light and weapon ready. An hour passed, but nothing happened. We were waiting there, every nerve strained to the utmost tension, but in vain. At last a sudden suggestion crossed my mind, and leaving Cardew in the room, with his torch ready, I went next door into Shaw's room, which was still dark, and, having closed the door, imitated that peculiar whistle of his. 3 or 4 times I whistled, surprised that I could imitate him so exactly. Then I waited, listening intently. I could hear nothing, so I crept back again to the bed and asked his room, for I think Cardew was now becoming impatient. Then, while lying upon the bed, I cautioned him to be very careful. Open your light at the slightest sound. Remember, I held my breath and could hear my own heart beating in the dead silence. Then after the lapse of a few moments, for we were both listening to the hum of a receding motor car and wondering whose it was, I suddenly gave vent to that low, curious whistle. Once, twice, thrice I repeated it, low and cautious, so that any one passing the door might not be attracted by it. Then I listened again with bated breath. A few seconds went by, seconds of intense anxiety. Then, of a sudden, my quick ears caught a curious ticking sound, and next moment a flood of white light fell upon the bedclothes close to my head. I sprang up with a shriek, for there, close to me, I saw something, the terrible claw-like hand. Chapter 29 discloses Shaw's secret. The thing was ugly, hairy, and horrible. A huge dark brown tarantula, the size of a man's palm, which the instant it was discovered, turned and sped across the bedclothes and disappeared in the darkness. Cardew had jumped to his feet with a wild, startled ejaculation of horror, having switched on the light. But though we rapidly searched the room high and low, yet nowhere could we find the horrible arachnid. But the secret was out. The revolting, hairy thing, which had on that night, in Audiobook appeared to me like a weird hand, was that huge venomous spider whose bite was as fatal as that of a cobra. Armed with sticks, Cardew and I groped into every hole and corner of that room, but it had vanished so suddenly that we could not decide in which direction it had gone. "Well," gasped my friend, amazed. "By gad, I never expected that." "Neither did I," was my breathless reply. "But the reason of poor Guy's death is now vividly apparent. He was bitten by that arachnid, which Shaw, in all probability, purposely left in his young friend's library prior to returning home on that fatal night. I think I realized the truth." I cried. This particular species of Lycosa tarantula is, I have read, found in the primeval forests of Peru and will only attack human beings when they are motionless or asleep. Its bite is most deadly. It causes stupor, followed by coma or paralysis, and the victim rapidly dies. Yet if the mark of its bite be concealed and unsuspected, as it may easily be in the hair, then the symptoms are identical with those of inflammation of the brain, the disease which from poor Guy is supposed to have died. Then you suspect Shaw of having kept the horrible thing as a pet. He gasped, staring at me amazed. "Both as a pet and as an instrument of murder," I replied. "The thing being nocturnal in its habits would, if introduced into a room, remain carefully hidden all day and only attack the victim at night while he is sleeping. I had a narrow escape while motoring in France with Shaw, and then, in a few words, I described my own experience and also asked his previous sight of what had appeared to both of us as a weird, uncanny hand. "Then this scoundrel Shaw evidently intended that you should die," he exclaimed. "By Jove, old chap, you have had a narrow escape." "Yes, he must have carried his dangerous pet in secret in a box, I suppose, and must have taken it away with him when he fled from Ike's." Then, suddenly recollecting that curious whistle of his, I realized how Shaw had used it in order to recall the great spider. "Put out the light, Cardew," I said. "Have your torch ready. I have an idea." But he hesitated in apprehension. "Have no fear. We want to see the hideous thing again, and to kill it," I said. The next second the room was once more in darkness, and after a few moments I began to imitate softly that peculiar whistle that I had learnt from Shaw. Then we waited in breathless silence, not moving a muscle. Again and again I whistled, but we could hear no movement. The huge spider was, we felt assured, somewhere in the room, but where we could not discover. Switch on the light. I cried at last, and in a second the place became illuminated again, when, to our surprise, halfway down the pink and white cretonne curtains at the head of the bed, the ugly arachnid, with its long claws, stood revealed and startled at the sudden turning on of the light. He had crept slowly down from the small canopy above the bed, seeking the place where I had lain. In an instant he turned to ascend the curtain again, but we were too quick for him, for with 2 or 3 sharp cuts with our sticks we brought him down, and he was quickly stretched dead upon the floor. I went forth boldly to search for Shaw, but could not find him. His room was in disorder, for he had apparently seized some things, packed hurriedly, and left. The car we heard leaving the house while we were in Asta's bedroom had evidently been his. He had escaped at the very moment when we had discovered the ingenious means by which he had committed his crimes. We called the 3 doctors and showed them the huge dead spider. Then, in a moment, all 3 agreed that Guy Nicholson had succumbed to its bite. An examination of poor, unconscious Asta's hair showed plainly where she, too, had been bitten just above the right ear. The trio of medical men stood utterly astounded. No time, however, was lost by Sir George in applying various antidotes and restoratives, and by dawn he came to me with the joyful news that she had taken a turn for the better. Our knowledge of the real cause of the ailment had only been gained in the very nick of time. Further examination of the walls of Asta's room resulted in the amazing discovery that the door of a cupboard in the wall beside the fireplace was warped and when closed left a space of an inch open at the bottom. The cupboard was lined inside with wood paneling, and in one panel at the back a tiny trapdoor about 4 inches square had been cut so that it could be removed from within the corresponding cupboard which was in Shaw's room adjoining. Investigation showed that the cupboard in question was the one secured by those 2 patent locks. And on breaking it open, we found that in it Shaw had kept the venomous spider, for both water and food were there, as well as a thick India-rubber glove which he no doubt used when he wished to handle his hideous pet, and a small wire cage in which it could be carried. In order to release it into Asta's room, he had only to move the small piece of cut panel in the back of its place of imprisonment, and, glad to escape, the thing would pass through, as no doubt it had done on the night when my well-beloved had been attacked. To recall it, Shaw had only to whistle. The spider knew the call. After the attack upon Asta, the scoundrel had evidently lost the reptile in the confusion, and disliking the light, it had found refuge on the small cretonne canopy fixed against the ceiling over the head of the bed. Knowledge that its bite had not proved fatal, as in Nicholson's case, and that Asta might recover and describe what she had seen, together with the fact that he had been unable to induce his pet to return to him, had terrified him, and he had escaped. Quickly I telephoned to the police in Northampton, and very soon 2 officers came out on bicycles, and to them we made a statement. Then, an hour later, a hue and cry was flashed across the wires for the assassin's arrest. Slowly, very slowly, Asta recovered consciousness, but I was not allowed to see her, nor was she allowed, indeed, to speak. Yet the knowledge that my beloved would again be given back to life was, in itself, all sufficient for me. I had at least solved 2 points in that amazing mystery of avarice and cunning. I had discovered the cruel, ingenious manner in which Guy Nicholson had been killed because of the knowledge he had accidentally gained, and I had also established the fact that Shaw intended that poor Asta should succumb. But what was the motive of this double crime? That point was, in itself, the most puzzling point of all. Chapter 30. The 3rd of November. Through the whole of the following day, I remained at the hall, but as may be imagined, the consternation was great when it became known to the servants, and through them to the countryside, that Mr. Harvey Shaw, the eminently respectable county magistrate, was being searched for by the police. Curious how quickly popularity disappears at the first breath of scandal. The very persons who had been loudest in Shaw's praises were now the first to hint at dark things and declare that they had all along suspected him of leading a double life. Sir George remained, but the 2 local practitioners went forth to do their daily rounds. Asta had greatly improved, and though ordered not to refer to the tragic events of the past few hours, I was allowed to see her for 5 minutes about 7 o'clock. wan and very pale. She was in a blue silk dressing jacket, propped up with pillows. As I entered, she put out her small white hand, and a single trembling word, my name, escaped her lips. I saw in the shaded light that her big eyes were filled with tears, tears of joy by which mine were also dimmed. I've had such a bad dream," she managed to say. "But oh, Mr. Kimball, how glad I am that it is only a dream, and that the doctor says I am getting better. I hope, Miss Seymour, that you'll be quite right and about again within a week," exclaimed Sir George cheerily. And hearing those words, she turned her wonderful eyes full on mine. What words of sympathy and congratulation I uttered, I scarcely know. How can I remember? I only recollect that when the great specialist touched me upon the shoulder as sign to leave her bedside, I bent and kissed her soft white hand. All through the day and all that evening, I remained eagerly expecting to hear news of Shaw's arrest. Yet, knowing what a past master he was in the art of evading the police, I despaired that he would ever be caught and brought up for punishment. As I sat smoking in his armchair in the big morning room, I reflected deeply and saw with what marvelous cunning and forethought he had misled Nicholson, Asta, myself, and, indeed, everybody, into a belief that he was devoted to the girl whom, so many years ago, he had adopted and brought up as his own daughter. That decision to kill her lover and afterwards kill her was no sudden impulse, but the result of a carefully thought-out and ingenious plan. Whether the huge tarantula had been put into my room at that French inn with evil intent, or whether it had got loose and had concealed itself there, I could not determine. In the case of Guy and Asta there must, I decided, have been some very strong incentive, a motive which none had ever dreamed. As regards the incident at Scarborough, he must have placed the tarantula in Asta's room in secret, and have succeeded in regaining possession of it. Indeed, inquiry I afterwards made showed that he had bribed one of the maidservants while everyone was absent to show him the house, his explanation being that he thought of purchasing it. Shaw was a master criminal, bold and defiant, yet he was at the same time ever ready with means for escape in case he was cornered. His exploit in the hotel at Ike's showed how cunning and clever he was in subterfuge. He preserved a cloak of the highest respectability, and had even succeeded in being placed on a roll of justices of the peace. The man who regarded murder as the practice of science had actually sentenced poachers, wife-beaters, tramps, and drunkards to terms of imprisonment. And yet so clever had he been that the Criminal Investigation Department had never recognized in the wealthy tenant of Lidford Hall the fugitive for whom they had so long been in search. A second night, I remained there, so as to be near the woman I loved so fervently. Sir George gave me an assurance, as we sat together before we turned in for a few hours' sleep, that his patient was progressing favorably, and that I might again see her the next day. Cardew also remained, and as we three sat smoking we discussed the strange affair, wondering what motive the man Shaw could possibly have in attempting so ingeniously and in such cold blood a second crime. But we could arrive at no definite conclusion. The whole affair was entirely shrouded in mystery. In the morning I was permitted to see Asta again. She seemed much better and spoke quite brightly. "Mr. Kimball," she said, after we had been chatting for some minutes, I want to tell you something very important when we are alone." "No, not now, Miss Seymour," interrupted Sir George, shaking his finger at his patient and laughing. "Later on, a little later on. You must not excite yourself today." And so, with a pretty pout, she was compelled to remain silent at the doctor's orders. I suppose I must have been there a full quarter of an hour, though the time passed so rapidly that it only appeared like a few moments. Then I bade her be of good cheer and went forth again. She had made no mention of the man who was a fugitive. The only poignant remark she had made was a warning. "Be careful when you go into my bedroom. There is something in there," she had said, but I had only laughed and promised her that I would not intrude. About 11 o'clock, Redwood arrived, and as he met me in the hall, he pushed a copy of that day's Times under my nose, asking, "Seen this, Mr. Kimball? It concerns you, I fancy. That's the name you mentioned yesterday, isn't it?" Eagerly, I scanned the lines which he indicated. It was an advertisement, which read, "Re Melville, Arnold." Will the gentleman to whom Mr. Melville Arnold has entrusted a certain ancient object in bronze kindly deliver it according to promise? First communicating with Messrs. Fryer and Davidson, solicitors, 196 London Wall, London, E.C. I read it again and again. Then of a sudden I recollected that it was the 3rd of November. On that day, I had instructions to deliver the bronze cylinder to the first person who made application for it. The low, soft-spoken words of the dying man as he had handed me the heavy cylinder, bidding me keep it in safe custody, recurred to me as I stood there with a newspaper in my hand. So I resolved to go at once to London and call upon the firm who had advertised. Soon after 3 o'clock, therefore, I ascended in the lift of a large block of offices in London Wall and entered the swing doors of Messrs. Fryer and Davidson. When asked by the clerk for my name, I gave a card, adding that I had called in response to the advertisement, and a few moments later found myself in a comfortable private room with a thin, clean-shaven, thin-faced, alert-looking man of middle age, who introduced himself as Mr. Cyril Fryer, the head of the firm. After thanking me for my call, he said, "Perhaps, Mr. Kimball, I may tell you briefly what I know of our client, Mr. Melville Arnold's rather eccentric action. He lived mostly abroad in recent years for certain private reasons, and one day, early this year, we received from him a somewhat curious letter upon the notepaper of the Carlton Hotel, saying that he had returned to England unexpectedly, and that he had entrusted a certain bronze cylinder containing something very important to the care of a friend. That friend was, curiously enough, not named, but he instructed us to advertise today, the 3rd of November. We made inquiry at the Carlton, but he was unknown there. Today we have advertised according to our client's instructions, and you are here in response. There is considerable mystery surrounding this affair, Mr. Fryer," I exclaimed in reply. "I do not doubt it. Our client, whom I have known for a good many years, was a very reserved and mysterious man," replied the solicitor, leaning back in his padded chair. "Well," I said, "I met him on board ship between Naples and London, and then in detail described his sudden illness, how he had induced me to accept the trust, and his death, a narrative to which Mr. Fryer listened with greatest interest. Then the letter must have been written on the afternoon of his arrival in London. He probably wrote it in the smoking room of the Carlton. But why he should seek to mislead us, I cannot imagine," exclaimed the solicitor. "I recollect," I said. "I was with him in a taxi when he stopped at the Carlton and went inside, asking me to wait. I did so, and he returned in about a quarter of an hour. In the meantime, he must have written to you. He was very ill then, and that same evening he died. He did not mention us. He made no mention whatever of any friends, save one, a Mr. Donnelly, to whom I afterwards delivered a note." "Donnelly," repeated Mr. Fryer. "You mean Harvey Shaw?" "Exactly. So you know him, eh?" The solicitor nodded in the affirmative, the deep lines upon his thin face becoming more accentuated. I then told him of his client's willful destruction of a large quantity of English banknotes, which he had compelled me to burn, whereat the man seated at his table laughed grimly, saying, "I do not think we need regret their destruction. They were better burnt." "Why?" "Well, because they were not genuine ones." "But surely, your client was not a forger?" I cried, "Certainly not. He was a great man, cruelly misjudged by the public. He was compelled in recent years to hide his real identity beneath another name and live in strictest retirement. His actions were put down as eccentricities, but he was a great thinker, a wonderful organizer, marvelously modern among modern men, a man whose financial schemes brought millions into the pockets of those associated with him, yet whose knowledge of ancient Egypt and dry-as-dust Egyptology was perhaps unique. But above all, he was ever honest, upright, and just. He was a complete enigma to me, I declared, as he was to most people. I, who have been his legal advisor and friend through much adversity, alone understood him. I was not even aware of his death. If he took a liking to you, I shall not be surprised to find that he has left you a substantial legacy. He gave me a present before he died," I said, and told him of the banknotes I had found in the envelope, and also that I held the cylinder in the security of the Safe Deposit Company's vaults in Chancery Lane. Finding the solicitor was perfectly frank and open with me, I related the curious and startling circumstances which had occurred within my knowledge since I had made the acquaintance of Mr. Harvey Shaw. As I sat in the fading light of that November afternoon, I narrated the facts in their proper sequence, just as I have herein set them down in the foregoing pages of this personal history. The man before me sat with folded arms in almost complete silence, listening intently to every word. The twilight faded and darkness fell quickly, as it does in November in the city. He had given orders that we were not to be disturbed, and he sat silent, so transfixed by my strange story that he did not rise to switch on the light. I told him all, everything, until I described to him the discovery of that venomous tarantula in Asta's bedroom. Then he suddenly struck his table with his fist and sprang to his feet, crying, I've been expecting to hear of this all along. The scoundrel meant to kill the poor girl. There were reasons, very strong reasons, for doing so. What were they? I demanded quickly. I have told you everything, Mr. Fryer. Now, be quite frank with me, I beg you, and tell me the whole truth. He was silent. I could hardly distinguish his thin, deeply lined face seated as he was in the shadows, his back to the window, so dark had it now become. Presently, he rose and turned on the light, saying as he did so, Well, Mr. Kemble, as you seem to have been so intimately associated with the closing scenes of poor Melville Arnold's career, I will explain the whole truth to you, even at the risk of a breach of professional confidence. My client is dead, but the dastardly attempt upon Miss Asta Seymour must be avenged. That man Harvey Shaw shall be brought to justice. Listen, and I will tell you a story stranger than most men have ever listened to, a romance of real life of which, however, every word is the truth. The cylinder, I cried. Are you aware of what is contained in it? I have not the slightest knowledge, he declared. That we will investigate together later, after you have heard the strange romance of the man whom you knew as Melville Arnold. Chapter 31. The Truth Concerning Arnold. The real name of your friend was, as you have guessed from the threatening letters addressed to him at Kingswear, in Devon, Arnold Edgecombe. The solicitor commenced, leaning his elbows upon his table and looking me straight in the face. My firm acted for his father, a wealthy manufacturer in Bradford, who, upon his death, left his son an ample fortune. 20 years ago, he married an extremely pretty woman. It was purely a love match, and one daughter was born. 6 months after that event, however, poor little Mrs. Edgecombe died of phthisis, and her husband was inconsolable over his loss. He was devoted to his wife, and the blow proved a terrible one. Soon, in order to occupy his mind, he turned his attention to financial affairs in the city and went into partnership with a man named Henry Harford. Harford, I ejaculated. Why, that was the man against whom he warned me. The words he wrote down are still in my possession. He had strong reasons for doing so, went on the man sitting at his table. The combination of the pair, both of whom were fearless and successful speculators, soon raised the firm to the position of one of the best-known financial houses in London. They dealt in millions, as others deal in thousands, and both men, in the course of a few years, amassed great fortunes. Suddenly, when just in the zenith of their prosperity, a great and terrible exposure was made. It was found that they had, by promoting certain bogus companies, which had been largely taken up, netted huge profits. The shareholders, numbering many thousands of widows, clergymen, retired officers, and such like persons, who were ever ready to swallow the bait of a well-written prospectus, became furious, and the public prosecutor took up the matter actively. Though my client was, I assure you, utterly blameless in the matter, and afterwards paid back every penny he had received from the transaction, nevertheless such public outcry was made against him as a swindler, that, victim of circumstances, he was compelled to fly the country, trusting implicitly to his partner, Harford, who, by a very shrewd move, cleared himself, although he was, no doubt, the actual culprit. He, on the night of his flight, placed his little daughter, to whom he was entirely devoted, in his care, urging him to adopt her, and not to allow her to know her real father's name. What? I cried, starting suddenly to my feet as the amazing truth flashed upon me for the first time. Then Asta is Edgecombe's daughter, and Shaw's real name is Harford. Exactly. With these facts in your mind, you will be able to follow me more closely. Again, I sank back into my chair astounded. Well, he went on, ingeniously as did Harford endeavor to cover his connection with the bogus promotions, of which the Britannia Banking Corporation, which you will remember perhaps was one, yet the public prosecutor, after the accounts and books had been examined, decided that he was also a culprit, and 2 months after his partner's disappearance a warrant was also issued for his arrest. Harford, always wary, had, however, on the day previously, taken little Asta with him and left for Greece, with which country we have no treaty of extradition. Meanwhile, Edgecombe had a younger sister who had married a man of bad character, an expert forger of banknotes, named Earnshaw, and who sometimes went in the name of King, and the pair had, to a great extent, assisted Harford in his fraudulent schemes entirely unknown to Edgecombe. The woman and her husband were adventurers of the most ingenious class, and with Harford, reaped a golden harvest in the circulation on the continent of the clever imitations of Bank of England notes. Edgecombe was all unconscious of this, and indeed only became aware of the transactions by accident. It seems that on the night of his flight from England, he went to the office after it had been locked up in order to get some cash for his journey. There was only £40 in the safe, but on breaking open a drawer in his partner's table, he found a big roll of new notes. He took them and left on the table a memorandum of what he had done. Ere he arrived at Dover, however, suspicion grew upon him that the notes were not genuine. So he kept them and said nothing. It was his first suspicion that Harford was playing a double game. Through all the years that elapsed from that day till his death, they remained in his possession as evidence against Earnshaw and his accomplice. But in order that after his death they should not be found in his possession, he apparently got you to destroy them. But this man Harford, or Shaw, who was he? I inquired eagerly. Of that I know very little, except that, before meeting Edgecombe, he had lived for many years in Ecuador and Peru, where he had been engaged in the adventurous pursuit of collecting orchids and natural history specimens. Probably while there, he knew of the giant venomous tarantula and had trained one to answer to his call, was Mr. Fryer's reply. Apparently, from what you have told me concerning the threatening letter, Edgecombe's sister suspected him of betraying her to the police, and, after serving her sentence for swindling, she and her husband again became on friendly terms with Harford, who, in the name of Harvey Shaw, was then posing as a county magnate, deriving his income partly from the proceeds of his financial transactions, and partly from the passing at various banks on the continent the bogus notes printed in secret in a room at Ridge Hill Manor. It was for that reason the police of Europe have, for the last 10 years, been in search of Harford. The English police because of the charges against him in the city, and the European police because he has defrauded hundreds of bureaus de change all over the continent by exchanging thousands of his marvelous imitations of Bank of England notes for foreign notes or gold. Yet being a man of such colossal ideas, such a splendid linguist, and possessing such marvelous powers of invention and clever evasion, he acted so boldly and sustained his role of English gentleman so well that he often passed beneath the very noses of those in active search of him. Then Edgecombe was in entire ignorance of the true character of his late partner. I exclaimed, absolutely, until too late. He only became convinced on the day of his death. He wished you to assist him, though he warned you against him. Apparently, by slow degrees, during his rare visits to England, he had become cognizant of Harford's criminal instincts, and of the fact that he was in possession of that venomous pet which the man had once, I believe, boastingly described as his hand. Yet Edgecombe was diplomatic enough not to quarrel with him. Asta, ignorant of her parentage, looked upon Harford as her father and held him in highest esteem. For Edgecombe to denounce him would be to disillusion the girl in whom all his hopes were centered, and who regarded him, not as a father, but as a very dear friend. On arrival in England, he seems to have written immediately to her, urging her to meet him, unknown to Harford. Yet, when she went to the hotel, it was only to discover that he was dead. But the terrible tarantula, the hand, as Harford termed it, Surely Edgecombe must have suspected something, I said. He probably was unaware that the thing was so deadly venomous, and he never dreamed to what use the scoundrel would put it, said the solicitor. The truth only dawned upon him when too late. Remember, he placed the utmost confidence in you, and in you alone, a stranger. Yes, he gave me that bronze cylinder. I wonder what it can possibly contain. Let's take a taxi down to Chancery Lane, Mr. Fryer suggested. Let us carry it up here, open it, and ascertain. Chapter 32. A Heart's Secret. Mr. Edgecombe was always of an antiquarian turn of mind, and when he left England, he took up the study of Egyptology in order to occupy his time, said the solicitor, as we sat in the taxi whirling along Newgate Street. He spent many years in Egypt, and being, of course, in possession of ample funds, he was enabled to make very extensive explorations, for which he was granted special privileges by the Khedive. Many of his discoveries have enriched the British Museum, the Louvre, and other museums on the continent, while stored here in London, in a place of which I hold the key, is a magnificent and valuable collection of objects from the period of Shahrukh down to that of the first Amenhotep, all of which will pass into the possession of his daughter, Miss Asta. Even the collection in the British Museum cannot compare with them in value or interest. Every object in our late client's collection is absolutely unique. As is the bronze cylinder, I added. Yes, I confess I have been filled with wonder as to what it can contain ever since the receipt of the letter asking us to advertise on the 3rd of November for an unknown person. Yourself, Mr. Kemble. Whatever were the actions of the late Mr. Edgecombe, we must not lose sight of the main fact that the death of his wife, whom he adored, caused in him certain eccentricities. He was devoted to his little daughter Asta, and in order that she should never know that her father had been accused and compelled to fly from justice, he induced his partner to adopt her, only to discover afterwards that he was a criminal and unscrupulous, and was, moreover, in association with a man and woman who were undoubtedly criminals. Yet having taken the step he had done 10 years before, he could not well draw back. I advised him, as soon as exposure came, to stay and face the music. But the death of his wife had utterly broken him, and his only reply was to say that he was tired of an active business life and preferred obscurity and study abroad. Yes, Mr. Kemble, added the man at my side, Arnold Edgecombe was a decidedly remarkable man, a man of great talent and attainments, of wondrous perception, and honest as few men in this city of London are honest nowadays. He knew that Harford arrest would bring disgrace upon Asta, and for that reason urged you to become his friend. The situation was indeed unique. On arrival at the safe deposit vaults we found, unfortunately, that they had been closed a quarter of an hour. Therefore there was nothing to do but to wait till next morning. So, after some final words with Fryer, I left him, promising to return on the morrow, and then drove straight to St. Pancras and went down to Lidford, arriving there soon after 9 o'clock. Asta was, I found, so much better that she had been left in charge of a nurse whom Sir George had summoned from London that day, and at my urgent request, she allowed me to see her patient alone. As I stood beside her bed, our hands clasped in meaning silence, I saw that she smiled gladly at my arrival. Then, presently, when she had motioned me to a chair and I had congratulated her upon her rapid progress towards recovery, I related in as quiet a voice as I could all that I had learned that day in London. Mr. Arnold was my father, she cried, looking at me amazed and stupefied. I never knew that. I can't believe it. And yet how kind he has always been to me. What beautiful presents he used to buy for me when I was a child, and how tenderly he used to kiss me when we met. Ah, yes, she cried. I ought to have known. I ought to have guessed. Poor dear father. And he died without betraying to me the secret of my birth. He was a lonely man. Asta, I said in a low voice, calling her by her Christian name for the first time. He loved your mother and revered her memory. And he kept from you the secret that he had been cruelly misjudged as a shark and a swindler. He entrusted you to the man I know as Shaw, believing him to be upright and a friend. But alas, how greatly his confidence has been abused. Her eyes were filled with tears. You alone, Mr. Kemble, have stood my friend, she said scarcely above a whisper, as she turned her bright gaze upon me. When I saw that terrible spider in my room, I sent word to you, after chasing it out into the corridor. A vague suspicion that it had been placed there purposely crept over me. But Shaw must have allowed it to pass into my room again after I had dropped off to sleep. I was your father's friend, I replied, and I hope. Poor dear father. Why did he not tell me? He wrote to me to come to the hotel, urging me to say nothing to Mr. Shaw. Perhaps he had something to tell me. Who knows? She exclaimed reflectively. But I arrived there, alas. Too late, too late. He probably intended to reveal to you the truth, I remarked, looking into her pale, wan countenance. But had he done so, perhaps you and I would not have been such close friends as we are today. Perhaps not, she sighed. I remember how, when we motored to Ike's, Shaw was very careful of the little box. Ah, yes, I owe more to you than I can ever repay. No, I said softly, but let me make a confession to you, Asta, and I took the tiny hand that lay outside the down quilt. When I first knew you, I grew jealous of poor Guy forgive me, because Asta, I loved you. Her pale face reddened, and her eyes were downcast. She tried to withdraw her hand from mine, but I knew what a good, honest fellow he was, and I determined to become his friend. Alas, his friendship for me, because he intended to consult me and tell me what he had discovered, cost him his life. Oh no, she cried. Do not recall that. It is all too terrible, too terrible. I know what a blow it was for you. I went on madly. I suffered all your poignant grief because I loved you. No. Let me finish. Let me tell you, Asta, now, once and for all, what I feel and what is in my heart. I knew that, with memories of poor Guy still upon you, that you could care nothing for me, perhaps barely like me. I know that at first you almost felt you hated me, yet I have kept my secret to myself, and I have loved you, Asta, loved you better than mere words of mine can tell. And I bent and drew her gently to me. She made no response. Only she looked at me swiftly, and a long sigh escaped her lips. In all my life, I have never loved any woman but you. So long as I live, I never shall, I declared in a fervent voice. If you're not my wife, Asta, then no other woman will ever be. I cannot speak before, I dare not. I cannot think that you even liked me, and I should have to take time to teach you the sweet lesson I long to teach you. But tonight, my beloved, I have thrown hesitation to the winds. Now that you are to live, I have told you, I ask you, my love, to be my wife. And I thought, yes, I said, tightening my hold upon her hand and placing my arms softly about her neck. I never thought that you loved me, she said suddenly. But the look in her splendid eyes, the tone of her voice, the rare sweet smile which parted her lips in sheer gladness, unconsciously shown at my confession, told me more than a whole volume of words could have told me. And slowly my lips met hers in a long kiss, a long, long kiss of ecstatic love, a kiss that changed my whole life from that moment. I love you, dearest. I love you with all my soul, I said, looking down at the pale, thin little face that rested upon my shoulder as she lay. You love me. Her words were scarcely a breath, but I heard them clearly enough in the silence of the room. I love you, I repeated, with fervor and simplicity. I love you, Asta, as I have never loved, and as I shall never love again. But you, it is of you that I have had the doubt. It is your love that I have feared I might not yet have one. Have you nothing to say to me? You rest here in my arms. You have let me kiss your lips. Through the room, there sounded a half laugh, half sob that silenced me. Two soft arms wound themselves about my throat and lay softly there. Two sweet tear-dimmed eyes looked straight into mine with something in their depths that held me silent for sheer joy, and two warm lips lifted to mine gave me back, shyly, one out of my many caresses. Yes, Lionel, I do love you, she said at last, so low that I had to bring my ear close to her lips to catch the words. And if you really mean that you want me for your wife. Really mean it, I echoed. My dear love, cannot you understand that I live for you alone? Only you, that for you to be my wife is the greatest, almost the only wish of my life. "Then it shall be as you wish," she said softly. What passionate words escaped me, I do not remember. All I know is that our lips met again and again many, many times, and we sat in each other's embraces childishly blissful in our newborn happiness. For a long time, indeed, no further word was spoken between us. Our minds were too full for mere, uttered phrases. Thus we sat until recalled to a sudden consciousness of the situation by the nurse's light tap upon the door. Then, before I left that room, and heedless of the presence of the nurse, I bent and kissed fondly upon the lips my wife, who was to be. Ah, can I adequately describe my feelings that evening, my heart bursting to tell to some intimate friend the secret of our love? No, I will leave you who have loved to imagine the boundless joy I felt at the knowledge that Asta loved me after all, and that we were betrothed. Chapter 33. Plot and Counterplot. In London next day, I met Mr. Fryer by appointment at 11:30 at the Holborn restaurant, being near Chancery Lane, and together we went to the Safe Deposit Company's vaults, where we obtained the ancient cylinder from the strong box in which I placed it, and then entered a taxi and drove to the city. Across Holborn, in Red Lion Street, we found a locksmith and took him with us to Fryer's office in London Wall. He brought with him some tools, but when he seated himself and examined the mysterious cylinder, he shook his head, remarking, "This will be a pretty tough job. It's been very well welded together. I'll have to file it off." "Is it ancient welding?" I asked. "Oh no, sir. It's a very ancient bit o' bronze, but the top's been off of late, and when welded on it's been painted over green to imitate the patina of the old bronze. Whoever did it was one of those fakers of antiques, I should say." "Well," said the solicitor, "make a start on it and get it open." The mechanic seated himself at the table and, taking up a long, sharp file, began to cut into the hard metal, while we stood aside watching him intently. What could it be that was so securely concealed therein? The thing that had been withheld even from Mr. Fryer, the dead man's confidant in everything. For a quarter of an hour the man worked hard, but made little or no impression upon the ancient metal. So the solicitor took me into an adjoining room, where after a brief chat he said, "Since our conversation last night, I've been carefully weighing matters. The motive of the cruel and ingenious assassination of your friend Nicholson is perfectly plain. Harford knew that there was a will in existence. For now, I recollect Mr. Edgecombe, after getting me to make it, told me that he had revealed its provisions to his friend. They are that his daughter should inherit the whole of his very substantial fortune, but in the event of her death while unmarried, it was to go to Harford himself, in recognition of his friendship and of his kindness to Miss Asta. Now, if Nicholson had married her, the money would have passed beyond his control. Therefore, aided, no doubt, by Earnshaw and his wife, they killed him by a method which fully bears out my estimate of the craft and cunning of my client's late partner. Edgecombe, not long before his death, had somehow become aware of the existence of the huge spider, kept as a pet, and having suspicions as to what use it might be put to, warned you of it with his last effort. Nicholson, against whom it is more than probable an unsuccessful attempt was made one night while sleeping at the Hall, also discovered Harford's secret. He intended to reveal it to you, but was attacked and succumbed before he could call upon you. Harford next feared lest you might propose marriage to his ward, hence the fact that he carried his pet to the continent with him, and you saw the terrible hand and narrowly escaped its fatal grip on that night in the old French inn. Yes, Mr. Kemble, Fryer added, depend upon it that Harford played his last card when he allowed the terrible spider to pass into Miss Asta's bedroom. He intended that she should die, and that Arnold Edgecombe's fortune should be his, a plot which would, alas, have been successfully accomplished had your suspicions not been providentially aroused. A sudden call from a locksmith caused us to return hastily to Fryer's room, and there we saw that the top of the ancient cylinder had been filed entirely off. "There's something inside, sir," said the man, addressing the solicitor. "Perhaps you'd like to take it out yourself." And Mr. Fryer drew forth a portion of an ancient leather thong, attached to which was a large old seal of clay, with an ancient Egyptian cartouche impressed upon it. Chapter 34. What the cylinder contained. Mr. Fryer then took the cylinder in his hand, and with eager fingers first drew forth a piece of modern paper about 6 inches long, folded lengthways many times. When he opened it, I saw that parts of it were brown as though scorched, while it bore at its base one of the long green stamps used in the consular service, obliterated together with attesting signatures. At a glance, he recognized its nature. "Why," he exclaimed, "this is a fresh will signed a year ago before the British Consul General at Naples." "Ah," he went on, reading it swiftly. "I see. His disillusion regarding Harford, whom he believed to be his friend, caused him to revoke his previous will, and by the terms of this he leaves his entire fortune, as well as what may accrue from the enclosed knowledge, unconditionally to his daughter Asta, but in the event of her death, it is to go to found a sanatorium for the treatment of destitute consumptive patients." Then he must certainly have had suspicions of Harford. Without a doubt. In order to warn Asta of the existence of that deadly spider, and probably to make other provisions for her, he came to England from Egypt, but unfortunately died on the day prior to her call at the hotel. When he wrote to me, he, no doubt, felt a presage of imminent death, for he knew well that he suffered from heart affection and might expire quite suddenly. He intended, by making this new will in secret and placing it in your hands, that should Asta expire mysteriously, the assassin would receive a shock at finding that the money did not revert to him after all. "And see," he said, "read what is written here." I peered over his shoulder and read the lines of small but clear handwriting at the foot of the document, evidently penned after it had been completed at the consulate. "Memorandum made by me this 4th day of February, 1909. In case of the sudden or mysterious death of my dear daughter Asta before the opening of the cylinder, I desire that the circumstances of her death be fully investigated. The man Harford, alias Harvey Shaw, in whose charge I injudiciously placed my beloved daughter, keeps as pet a specimen of the Lycosa tarantula of Ecuador, which is most venomous and dangerous, and will attack human beings when they are asleep. In Ecuador and Peru, on account of its size and formation, it is known as the death hand. Inquiries I have made show that a bite causes inflammation of the brain, so that medical men in South America are very frequently deceived. I have suspicions that the man Harford intends to use his pet for purposes of secret assassination, and hereby place my strong convictions upon record for my above-named executor, Mr. Cyril Fryer, to use at his own will and discretion. Signed by me, Arnold Edgecombe. By Jove, I said, that's a pretty plain allegation. Yes, and not far short of the truth, replied my friend. With these suspicions in his mind, I wonder what could have been the nature of his letter to Harford which you delivered at Totnes Station. It was addressed in the name of Donnelly, one of the names he used, one of his actual Christian names. It is evident, however, that in it he gave Harford no cause to suspect that he was aware of the existence of the strange pet. Otherwise, he would not have made that too successful attempt upon Nicholson. Yes, but by its delivery he knew that its writer was dead. I said, your client, perhaps, acted with some indiscretion in sending it. It at once placed Asta in peril. He had a motive, no doubt, but it imperiled Asta. Yet if he had not sent it, you would never have met the young lady, or been instrumental in exposing the clever and ingenious plot from which she has so narrowly escaped with her life, the solicitor remarked. The locksmith had been paid and retired, so we were again alone together. The wording of this latest will is peculiar, Mr. Fryer went on. It refers to all that may accrue from the enclosed knowledge. What enclosed knowledge, I wonder? And taking up the cylinder, he again looked into it. Why, there's something else here, he exclaimed, and inserting a long steel letter opener, he succeeded in drawing forth a small roll of ancient brown papyri, which, very tender and crumbling, was covered by puzzling Egyptian hieroglyphics. This, in all probability, he exclaimed, is what the cylinder originally contained when he discovered it in the tomb of the great Marenta. We must obtain a translation. Yes, I cried eagerly. Let's take it to the British Museum. Professor Stewart will be able to decipher it at once. So, replacing the papyri in its bronze case, we took it with us in a taxi, and half an hour later sat in the room of the professor, the same eminent Egyptologist whom I had seen on my previous visit there. The great scholar put on his spectacles very leisurely, and with great care opened the crumbled relic out before him as he sat at this table and placed a sheet of glass over it. Then for a long time he pored closely over the queer, crude drawings. At last he broke the silence as he looked up at us through his round glasses, saying, "This, I may as well tell you, is one of the most remarkable and interesting records that have ever come out of Egypt, and, like the papyri which I deciphered from Mr. Arnold, and which was found accompanying this cylinder, it is in the hieroglyphics in use during the period after Alexander the Great had delivered Egypt, and it was ruled by Ptolemy and his descendants. Ptolemy the First, you will remember, perhaps, reigned from 323 to 285 BC, and was succeeded by 12 other kings of his dynasty. The famous Cleopatra was daughter of Ptolemy the 11th, and in 43 BC became queen of Egypt. Here we have before us, upon this piece of papyri, a most important record concerning that famous woman. This was written at Thebes by one Sanehat, or Sanehat, son of the Sycamore, a general and a royal favorite in the year and month of Antony's death. Listen, and I will decipher one or two extracts to show you its purport, and carefully wiping his spectacles, the celebrated Egyptologist readjusted them, and then, examining the half-faded lines of hieroglyphics, said, "The opening is a long one in which Sanehat, son of the Sycamore, probably from his having been born or living at some place where there was a celebrated sacred sycamore, describes the love between Cleopatra and Antony, and the great treasures of the wonderful palace of the Ptolemies, which stood about in the center of the shore of the eastern bay of Alexandria. He relates how Antony and Octavian fought desperately for the possession of the world at the Battle of Actium, and how, after that wonderful royal banquet, which Athenaeus has already described to us in his writings, Antony sank deeper and deeper in the flood of his wild passion for Cleopatra. We have the queen's marvelous beauty, her fascinations, her limbs like gold and her hair like lapis lazuli, so precious in Egypt in those days, and her sins here described by the hand of one who was her most trusted general, and who, by the way, is mentioned in at least two other records of this period, one now preserved at St. Petersburg, and the other at Berlin, published in facsimile in the Denkmäler of Lepsius. It tells us of the gorgeous life led by this most brilliant queen of queens, of the wealth and favors she lavished upon Antony and his captains, and of how she built her tomb near the temple of Isis Laches, at the eastern end of the harbor, where Fort Silsile stands today. All this is most intensely interesting, coming as it does from the hand of the queen's trusted favorite. But there is something more, something which certainly arouses our curiosity and which must be investigated. Listen, and I will read just the most important extracts. Then again he paused for a few moments, and halfway down the crinkled papyri he read a disjointed decipher as follows. The Horus, life of births, lords of crowns, life of births, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, keeper Hare, son of the sun, Enimhat, ever rising into eternity. Order for those who read. Behold, this order of the queen is sent to thee to instruct thee of her will. Cleopatra, whose ruling passion was to be a monarch of a greater Egypt and to enlarge the borders of the south, remained in the palace of her fathers, but Antony was valiantly defending the fortress of Pelusium against Octavian. In dead of night I was called by the Lord Steward unto the pearl chamber of the queen, and she, reclining upon her bed of pearl and gold with censers of sweet perfumes burning, commanded me to silence, and sent away her slaves. She had received Nebkar as messenger from Antony, telling her of Octavian's strength. She therefore commanded me with my captains Useref and Hordef to repair unto the treasury of the Weil house, and take possession of the greatest of her jewels, and place them in a place of safety, lest the accursed Octavian conquering, the palace be attacked. In obedience I called my two most trusted captains, and went in secret unto the White House, and opening it with the queen's own key, obtained therefrom much gold and precious stones, with the great jewels of Sadr of Eugates, and of Rudidid, and the sacred sapphires of Enimhat. And next night we concealed them. 5 times did we journey, under cover of night, unto the treasury, and in baskets of green tamarisk took therefrom strings of emeralds and of pearls and electrum and new malachite. The 100 rubies the size of pigeons' eggs, the goblets of gold and stones, and the great bowls of gold encrusted with jewels, which were served at the banquet to Antony. Know ye that 15 baskets full of precious stones of Ka, statues of gold, breast ornaments of emeralds, beads of lapis lazuli, and pearls of great price did we take and conceal in the place where Octavian, whose name be accursed, should not know. And at dawn, when our work was completed, I went again unto the queen, and kneeling told her of the place where we had hidden them. And R.A. had spread fear over the land, his terrors in every place, and the queen was greatly pleased, and rewarded me with 50 talents. And she commanded me to write this record, and to place it where it should remain through the ages, so that if death consumed her, the whereabouts of her treasure shall not be utterly lost unto the world. No, therefore, ye who dareth to open this tube of bronze which she gave unto me, and to face the wrath of the sun god, and of Osiris the eternal, that the pit where we have dug, and wherein we have concealed the great treasure in gold, and lazuli, and heart scarabs, and collal stones, set in gold of our queen Cleopatra the Magnificent, leath 300 cubits, and 7 towards the sunrise from the eastern angle of the temple of Dendera, which our queen hath founded, and which beareth her. Image graven by Eubianer upon its wall. With thy back unto the eye of her image pace 300 cubits and 7, and the gold and jewels which our queen secured for Antony. Shall there be found hidden? Aye, Sainhat, make this record, lest the great treasure of Cleopatra be lost for all time. I write this so that he beloved of R.A., of Horus, and of Hathor, who readeth this my message, may seek and may find. For Antony fought well, and went from battle unto death by his own hand, because he heard falsely that his queen was already dead. Yeah, in their splendor, but 1 moon ago, they founded the Synepathano-Menoi, the people who were about to die together. And so Antony took his life when he heard that his queen was dead. 2 suns have not set since Useref and Hordef, my loyal and well-beloved captains, were put to death by the queen's orders, the month Pauphi. The 7th day the god entered his horizon, so that they may not betray the hiding place of her jewels. And I have fled here unto Thebes, for alas, her hand is now uplifted against me for the same cause. And this written record will I place in the tomb of the great Marinta, that it shall remain there through generations in the keeping of R.A., till it be discovered by one of courage who cometh after me, and upon whom may the blessing of our great Osiris forever rest. Excellently finished in peace. He who destroyeth this roll, may Tahuti smite him. How curious! I exclaimed, utterly astounded. Does this temple of Dendera still exist? Most certainly, replied the professor. I myself have seen the graven image of Cleopatra upon its wall, as well as that of her child Caesarion. As far as I can distinguish, this record, which has reposed in its cylinder for nearly 2,000 years, is perfectly genuine, and as it is known that the marvelous Egyptian queen must have possessed untold treasures, this record of Sainhat should certainly be investigated. It was evidently written on the day of Cleopatra's death, but before the news that the gorgeous queen had committed suicide rather than be carried captive to Rome had become known. But does this wonderful collection of gems still exist, do you anticipate? Inquired Friar. Well, after reading such an authentic document as this, I am certainly inclined to believe that it may very possibly be found. I recall that the vicinity of the temple is desert, and that the ground at the spot indicated certainly shows no signs of recent excavation. Then knowledge of this papyri must be kept a profound secret, and the Egyptian government approached in confidence with a view to allowing exploration in the vicinity, Friar said, his business instinct at once asserting itself. Most certainly, replied the professor. I am, of course, most intensely interested in this matter, and if I can be of any assistance, I shall only be too happy. Personally, I believe that by this important papyri the great treasures which Cleopatra was known to possess, and of which history gives us no account after her death, may actually be recovered. Chapter 35. Conclusion. 12 months have passed. The days have slipped away rapidly since that well-remembered morning when I stood beside Professor Stewart and watched him, peering through his glasses, decipher those puzzling hieroglyphics which Sanehat had penned 2,000 years before. No doubt you read the newspapers, and of course have seen the interesting results of the excavations made and still being continued by the Egypt Exploration Fund, under the auspices of the Egyptian government, with whom Mr. Fryer, as the late Arnold Edgecombe's executor, came to a mutual arrangement. Professor Stewart has, for some months past, been out at the Temple of Dendera, that cyclopean pile which Cleopatra built for herself, and though from time to time vague reports have found their way into the papers of important discoveries close to that famous edifice, yet, truth to tell, we are endeavoring to keep the actual extent of the discoveries as private as possible for the present. All I can say is that ancient jewels, worth many thousands of pounds, taken from the spot have already reached London. Jewels, ornaments, and heart scarabs which once adorned the person of Egypt's most gorgeous queen. But it is of my own sweet-faced queen that I think the most, she who sits here in silent love beside me at Upton End as I now pen these final lines. We have already been man and wife for 8 months, and after a delightful honeymoon spent beside the Nile, during which we paid a visit, of course, to Cleopatra's temple, where Professor Stewart was superintending operations, have returned home and settled down in peace and happiness, a rural bliss, perfect and entire, that will last always. The hated name of Harvey Shaw is never mentioned between us, and little wonder indeed. Within a month after his flight from Lidford, 2 men, one a foreigner, called at night at a lonely cottage near Hexworthy, far away on wild Dartmoor, and asked to see the tenant, a gentleman who had recently taken the place furnished. The broad-speaking, old Devon housekeeper went upstairs to inform her master of his visitors, but she found the door locked. Shaw, for it was he, had recognized the voice of Victor Tramu, and knew instantly that he had at last been run to earth. The second visitor, a well-known officer from New Scotland Yard, rushed upstairs and called upon the accused to open the door, but on doing so they heard the report of a revolver, and, bursting in, found the assassin of poor Guy Nicholson lying shot through the head and quite dead. It appeared, too, that on the day following Harford's flight, Ridgehill Manor was found by the police to be tenantless, and Earnshaw and his clever wife have not yet been found. The police, however, are confident that, possessing only slight funds, they must be heard of again ere long at their old game of passing forged notes to continental money changers. Asta, instead of existing upon the charity of a criminal and unwittingly exchanging forged notes for genuine ones in gold, as she had done so many times, is now wealthy in her own right, while Mr. Fryer has received a very handsome legacy as executor. Cardew, fond of adventure, got 6 months' leave to assist in the excavations in Egypt, and recently, on his return, has been here at Upton End on a visit, and has told us much of interest concerning what has of late been found there. And as evidence of the genuineness of that half-faded record, penned by the trusted general of Cleopatra, whom she afterwards desired to kill in order to protect her secret of her treasure, and preserve for so long in that bronze cylinder, there stand before me, with the gold statuette of Osiris beneath domes of glass upon a side table in the library wherein I am this evening writing, a canopic jar of alabaster, and 4 ancient golden goblets varying from 7 to 10 inches in height thickly, encrusted with magnificent rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, the actual cups which once held the wine drunk at those gorgeous bacchanalian feasts which the great queen gave to Antony, over whom she exercised that fatal fascination. They represent but a specimen of what has already been recovered and is later on to be divided between the Egyptian government, the British Museum, and Asta herself. Though we are extremely careful to conceal the real facts from the papers, extensive works of examination are at this moment in progress, for it seems that the Queen's enormous wealth was buried hurriedly beneath stones in a watercourse which has ages ago dried up. The action of the water scattered the loose gems, as, from the sifting of the sand each day, precious stones, cut and uncut, are now being recovered. Never in these our modern days of progress and discovery has such a flutter of excitement been caused in archaeological circles, and certainly never has such a magnificent and authentic treasure, the lost million of Cleopatra, been located. Arnold Edgecombe, always attracted to the study of Egyptian archaeology, had devoted the last 17 years of his broken life to studies in Upper Egypt, and, truly, the discovery he made in the tomb of Merinta has resulted in the recovery of great numbers of the gems and ornaments actually worn by Cleopatra herself. Every national museum in Europe has eagerly offered to purchase specimens, hence the estate of the late Arnold Edgecombe. The man so cruelly misjudged and hunted down by the investing public will be greatly enriched by the remarkable discovery, which on that evening of his death he predicted to me would astound our prosaic modern world. Often have I congratulated myself upon my narrow escape from a sudden end on that night in the old French inn, for surely the cunning ingenuity and truly devilish resourcefulness of Asta's foster father from the moment when he so successfully cast the blame of fraud upon his friend Arnold Edgecombe and caused him to flee to Egypt until that night, when he so nearly succeeded in taking the young girl's life, showed him to be a veritable master criminal. But the days of darkness, insecurity, and despair are happily over. The clouds have parted, and the sunshine of happiness now falls upon the dear, sweet girl who, 8 months ago, knelt beside me at the altar of that gray, square-spired village church which, here as we sit in the summer sunset, we can see peeping beyond the old elm avenue across the park. Yes, my darling, I am at last truly happy, she whispers softly in my ear, bending over to kiss me in reply to a question. So happy that I cannot adequately describe what I feel amid this perfect peace. And so, with her sweet lingering caress upon my lips, a kiss more full of love and holy passion than ever Cleopatra gave Antony beside the Nile, I embrace her with all the tenderness of my affection, with all the strength of my very soul, and while so doing conclude this my strange personal narrative and write. And that brings us to the end of The Lost Million by William Le Queux. We hope you enjoyed this classic mystery filled with secrets, suspense, and surprise revelations. If you did, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Storytime Classics, and share it with friends who love timeless stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the ending. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more classic audiobooks brought to life just for you.